What if an ancient road once crossed a world that no longer exists? A land where forests stretched across places now buried beneath the sea, where people walked routes erased by rising oceans thousands of years ago. Today, only scattered clues remain hidden beneath waves, locked beneath layers of earth, and waiting to reveal a forgotten chapter of human history. Before we uncover this extraordinary mystery, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Now let's journey back to the impossible road that once connected a vanished world. The first sign that something impossible lies beneath the ground is not a towering monument or the outline of a forgotten city. It is a narrow strip of ancient timber emerging from dark, waterlogged earth after thousands of years in complete silence. At first glance, it appears ordinary, almost disappointingly simple. Yet that weathered wood once formed part of a road that crossed a landscape which no longer exists. Today, there is no forest surrounding it, no villages waiting beyond the horizon, no travellers carrying baskets, livestock, or stories from one settlement to another. Instead, there are fields, marshes, or open water depending on where the discovery is made. The world the road belonged to has vanished so completely that even its rivers have changed course and its coastline has been rewritten. For archaeologists, discoveries like these produce a rare kind of excitement. Roads are among the clearest signs that people intended to stay connected. A hunting trail can appear almost anywhere through repeated footsteps, but a constructed roadway represents planning, labour cooperation, and confidence in the future. Someone expected this route to matter not just for a season but for generations. Trees were cut. Heavy timbers were shaped with stone or early metal tools. The ground was prepared. Thousands of individual decisions combined into a single path stretching across terrain that resisted easy movement. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The mystery becomes even greater when the surrounding landscape is considered. Many of these ancient roads now lie buried beneath layers of peat clay or submerged coastlines. Modern visitors often see flat farmland, windswept wetlands, or shallow seas. Nothing in the present landscape suggests that an organized society once considered this place important enough to invest enormous effort in building permanent infrastructure. The road survives, but almost everything that once gave it meaning has disappeared. This contradiction is what makes such discoveries so captivating. Roads are built to connect places. When the places themselves vanish, the road becomes a message whose beginning and ending have been erased. It resembles a sentence with only the middle words preserved. Archaeologists must reconstruct the missing parts using scattered evidence, environmental records, microscopic plant remains, animal bones, fragments of pottery, and carefully dated timber. Every discovery adds another small piece to a landscape that has been absent from human memory for thousands of years. Throughout Europe and beyond, similar discoveries have repeatedly challenged long-held assumptions about prehistoric societies. Earlier generations often imagined Stone Age communities as isolated groups moving constantly through wilderness, with little long-term planning. Modern archaeology presents a far more complex picture. Evidence increasingly suggests that many prehistoric people actively shaped their environments, maintained trade networks across surprising distances, and engineered practical solutions to difficult geographical problems. The construction of long timber trackways across marshland stands among the clearest demonstrations of this capability. One famous example comes from wetlands where poor conditions prevented wood from decaying. Normally, timber disappears within decades or centuries. Here, however, entire sections remained preserved beneath saturated peat. Individual tool marks can still be identified. Tree rings remain visible. Some planks appear so carefully fitted that it becomes possible to imagine the workers lifting them into place, one by one, adjusting each section until the surface formed a stable crossing above unstable ground. These remarkable conditions create a kind of accidental time capsule. Organic materials that almost never survive elsewhere remain astonishingly intact. Alongside the wood, archaeologists sometimes recover woven baskets, footprints, seeds, insect pollen grains, leather fragments, and even traces of ancient meals. Such discoveries transform what could have been a simple engineering story into something much richer. The road becomes part of an entire living ecosystem frozen beneath the earth, yet the greatest surprise may be chronological. Many of these structures are far older than observers first expect. Some date back 5 or even 6,000 years, reaching into the Neolithic period, when farming communities were still establishing themselves across large parts of Europe. At that time, no written records described these landscapes. There were no maps, no surviving chronicles, and no kingdoms recording ambitious construction projects. Everything known today comes directly from physical evidence patiently uncovered layer by layer. Imagine standing beside one of these roads during its own lifetime. Instead of endless marsh stretching into the distance, there may have been dense woodland alive with birds, insects, and large mammals. Streams wound through reed beds. Elevated islands of dry ground supported clusters of wooden houses. Smoke drifted from hearths during cool mornings. Children learned familiar routes, while adults carried grain hides, timber-polished stone axes, or valuable amber gathered from distant shores. The road was not an isolated curiosity. It formed part of an active landscape filled with movement. Travel itself looked very different from modern expectations. There were no wheeled vehicles crossing these earliest trackways. Movement depended upon walking, carrying loads, leading animals, or perhaps dragging supplies using simple sledges where conditions allowed. Wet ground presented a constant obstacle. Every journey across marshland risked sinking into mud or becoming trapped in waterlogged vegetation. A carefully constructed timber surface dramatically reduced those dangers, allowing reliable movement throughout changing seasons. Building such a route demanded remarkable foresight. Workers first needed to understand the behavior of saturated ground. They selected suitable tree species, harvested them, efficiently transported heavy logs without modern machinery, and assembled them into durable structures capable of supporting repeated traffic. The evidence remains incomplete regarding exactly how labour was organised, yet the scale alone suggests cooperation extending well beyond a single household. Entire communities likely contributed knowledge, materials, and physical effort over extended periods. Even today, constructing roads across wetlands presents engineering challenges. Modern builders rely upon excavators, steel reinforcement, geotechnical surveys, and advanced drainage systems. Prehistoric communities possessed none of these advantages. Instead, they depended upon accumulated practical experience passed across generations. Every successful crossing represented countless observations about timber strength, seasonal flooding, soil stability, and local environmental conditions. The deeper archaeologists investigate these forgotten roads, the more they discover that the structures cannot be understood in isolation. They belong to entire worlds that have disappeared through rising seas, changing rivers, expanding peatlands, shifting climates, and thousands of years of natural transformation. The road itself endured only because unusual conditions preserved what would otherwise have rotted away. Everything surrounding it continued changing until almost every visible sign of that ancient landscape faded from view. That is the remarkable paradox at the heart of this story. The road seems impossible not because its builders lack the ability to create it, but because the world it crossed has vanished so completely that modern observers struggle to imagine it ever existed at all. Each preserved timber is therefore more than an engineering achievement. It is a surviving thread connecting the present to a forgotten landscape, where ordinary people built confidently for a future they believed would continue, never knowing that one day nearly everything around their carefully laid path would disappear beneath earth, water, and time. It is easy to assume that the landscape surrounding the impossible road always looked much as it does today. A broad marsh, an empty stretch of coastline, a quiet peat bog, or perhaps a shallow sea appears timeless to modern eyes. Yet every preserved plank tells a different story. The road belongs to an environment so transformed that stepping into it would feel less like travelling into the past than entering another world entirely. Long before water swallowed fields and peat-buried forests, this was a living landscape of remarkable diversity where people found opportunity rather than isolation. The transformation begins shortly after the end of the last ice age. Massive glaciers that once covered northern Europe gradually retreat, releasing enormous volumes of meltwater. Temperatures rise over centuries rather than decades, allowing forests to spread into territories that had previously supported only sparse tundra vegetation. Birch arrives first, followed by pine, hazel oak, elm, lime, and alder. The change is so complete that areas once dominated by ice become dense woodland filled with wildlife. What had been an inhospitable frontier slowly becomes one of the richest environments available to prehistoric communities. For thousands of years, this expanding forest supports an astonishing range of a life. Red deer move through clearings, wild boar root beneath towering oaks, aurochs, the gigantic wild ancestors of modern cattle, graze along riverbanks. Beavers reshape waterways with their dams, creating ponds that attract fish, waterfowl, and countless insects. Wolves and lynx patrol the deeper woods, while birds fill the canopy with constant movement. Every part of the landscape offers resources for those who understand its rhythms. The wetlands themselves are nothing like lifeless swamps. They form dynamic environments where fresh water, seasonal flooding, and fertile soils create extraordinary biological productivity. Reeds grow in dense stands, water lilies spread across quiet pools, fish thrive in slow-moving channels, migrating birds arrive in enormous numbers providing food during predictable seasons. Edible plants flourish along the margins of marshes, while medicinal herbs grow in sheltered clearings. For prehistoric people, these landscapes represent abundance rather than hardship. Rivers become the arteries of this forgotten world. They twist through forests in countless channels, sometimes changing course after heavy floods, but always connecting distant regions. Canoes carved from single tree trunks glide along these waterways, transporting people and goods with surprising efficiency. Archaeological discoveries of dugout canoes reveal remarkable craftsmanship, suggesting that water travel often complements movement on land. The impossible road is therefore not an isolated engineering project, but part of a broader transportation network linking rivers, settlements, hunting grounds, and sacred places. The coastline also looks dramatically different. During the early Holocene, global sea levels remain lower than they are today because so much water is still locked within melting glaciers. Vast areas of land now hidden beneath the North Sea remain exposed, forming broad plains crossed by rivers and dotted with lakes. This vanished landscape, often referred to by archaeologists as Doggerland, connects what are now the British Isles with continental Europe. People move freely across territories that later generations will only know as open water. Life in these regions follows seasonal rhythms that demand careful observation. Spring brings spawning fish into rivers along with nesting birds and the first edible shoots emerging from damp soils. Summer offers berries, abundant game, and opportunities to repair homes and tools. Autumn fills forests with nuts, fruits, and migrating animals preparing for winter. Even the cold months are far from empty. Ice strengthens certain crossings while preserving stored food gathered during more productive seasons. Communities survive not through constant struggle, but through intimate knowledge of environmental cycles repeated year after year. As farming gradually spreads across Europe, the landscape begins changing in more deliberate ways. Small clearings appear where forests are cut to create fields. Domesticated cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats graze near settlements. Wheat and barley grow alongside older traditions of hunting, fishing, and gathering. Rather than replacing one lifestyle with another overnight, evidence suggests a long period during which communities combine multiple strategies, depending upon local conditions. Flexibility becomes one of their greatest strengths. The road itself likely serves communities living within this blended economy. A marsh that presents an obstacle during one season may become an essential source of fish during another. Forests provide timber for houses, firewood, and tools, while nearby fields support crops that require reliable access regardless of weather conditions. A carefully maintained trackway ensures that movement continues even after heavy rain transforms surrounding ground into deep mud. Without such infrastructure, communication between neighbouring settlements could become dangerously unpredictable. Microscopic evidence recovered from ancient sediments provides remarkable insight into this vanished environment. Pollen grains preserved within peat allow scientists to reconstruct changing vegetation with surprising precision. One layer may reveal dense oak woodland. A slightly younger layer shows increasing alder associated with wetter conditions. Another records the appearance of cereal pollen indicating nearby farming. Tiny fragments of charcoal hint at controlled burning used to clear vegetation. Though invisible to the people who left them behind, these microscopic traces now function as one of archaeology's most valuable historical archives. Animal bones add further detail. The remains of fish reveal which rivers remained productive throughout the year. Bird bones indicate seasonal hunting patterns. The changing proportions of wild and domesticated species reflect shifting economies over centuries. Even insects contribute valuable information. Certain beetles survive only under specific environmental conditions, allowing specialists to estimate temperature, moisture, vegetation, and even the presence of grazing animals. The evidence remains incomplete, but together these fragments build an increasingly vivid portrait of a landscape long erased. One lesser-known detail emerges from preserved tree rings. Ancient oaks growing in these wetlands often live for centuries before being cut for construction. Their annual growth patterns record periods of drought, unusually wet years, and other environmental stresses. By matching overlapping ring sequences from different trees, researchers create chronological records extending back thousands of years. These natural archives help determine exactly when timbers were harvested and reveal how climatic fluctuations affected both forests and the people depending upon them. For those ancient builders, however, the environment is not simply a collection of resources, it is also a place of memory. Familiar trees mark meeting points. Rivers define territories without rigid borders. Certain wetlands may carry ritual importance as suggested by carefully deposited tools and objects recovered from waterlogged contexts across prehistoric Europe. Scholars still debate the full meaning of these deposits, but what survives in the archaeological record suggests that landscapes often held spiritual significance alongside practical value. Standing within this world, the impossible road no longer seems impossible at all. It becomes an entirely sensible response to the demands of everyday life. The people who build it are not attempting to conquer nature. They are learning to move with it, adapting their engineering to the seasonal pulse of forests, rivers, and wetlands that sustain them. Every plank laid across unstable ground reflects confidence that tomorrow's travellers will follow the same route, carrying harvests, children, news and traditions across a living landscape that appears permanent. Yet permanence is one of history's greatest illusions. Beneath the thriving forests and fertile marshes, forces already begin reshaping the land. Seas continue their slow rise. Rivers alter their channels almost imperceptibly. Peat accumulates year after year. The changes are so gradual that no single generation fully recognizes their significance. The world surrounding the road still appears secure, but time is quietly preparing one of the greatest transformations the landscape will ever experience. To modern observers, the most remarkable feature of the impossible road is often its survival. Yet for the people who first built it, survival was never the objective. Utility came first. The road existed because someone looked across a difficult landscape and concluded that crossing it repeatedly was worth an extraordinary investment of labour. That decision reveals something profound about the society responsible. Communities struggling only from one season to the next rarely devote hundreds of hours to projects whose greatest rewards lie in the future. The builders believed their settlements would endure, their children would inherit familiar roots, and the landscape would continue supporting the lives they had carefully established. Unlike the civilizations of Egypt or Mesopotamia, these communities leave no written records describing ambitious construction projects. There are no rulers boasting of engineering achievements carved into stone, no surviving tax records listing workers, and no official maps outlining transportation networks. Instead, archaeologists reconstruct the identities of the builders through quieter forms of evidence. The dimensions of houses, the distribution of settlements, the patterns of tool production, and the careful selection of timber all reveal societies that are far more organized than earlier generations of scholars once imagined. The people responsible belong to farming communities spreading across large parts of prehistoric Europe during the Neolithic and early Bronze Age. Agriculture has already transformed daily life, but hunting, fishing, and gathering remain essential parts of survival. Villages consist of timber houses arranged near rivers, fertile soils, and reliable water sources. Families cultivate cereals, care for livestock, and maintain long-standing relationships with neighboring settlements. Isolation is rare. Exchange becomes increasingly important as specialized skills develop within different communities. One village may possess access to exceptional flint for tool-making. Another controls valuable forests containing straight oak suitable for construction. A third lies near deposits of high-quality stone used to polish axes. Amber collected from distant coastlines gradually moves inland through networks extending hundreds of kilometers. Decorative shells appear far from the sea. Rare stone types found in ceremonial objects often originate in mountains that many owners never personally visit. The impossible road exists within this expanding web of movement and exchange. Building such a structure begins long before the first tree is cut. Experienced members of the community must identify the most practical route across unstable ground. A direct path may prove impossible if deep pools, shifting peat, or seasonal flooding threaten stability. Instead, the road follows subtle variations in elevation that are almost invisible today, but would have been recognized by generations familiar with the landscape. Knowledge accumulated through countless journeys becomes as valuable as physical labor itself. The choice of timber also reflects careful planning. Oak frequently appears in surviving trackways because of its exceptional durability, especially in permanently waterlogged conditions. Trees selected for construction are often mature, straight, and healthy. Felling one with polished stone axes requires patience and coordination. Experimental archaeology demonstrates that skilled workers using replica Neolithic tools can cut down large trees surprisingly effectively, though the task still demands hours of sustained effort. Once felled, the trunk must be trimmed, shaped, and transported across terrain that offers no wheeled carts capable of carrying such immense loads. Transport itself presents another remarkable challenge. Scholars still debate exactly how prehistoric communities moved heavy timbers through wetlands, but several possibilities remain plausible. During wetter seasons, logs may have floated along streams or shallow channels. On firmer ground, teams likely dragged them over rollers or sledges. Winter frost could temporarily strengthen soft soils, making movement easier than during warmer months. No single explanation fully accounts for every site, suggesting that builders adapted their methods to local conditions rather than following one universal technique. The construction process probably unfolds in stages. Workers first prepare the route by clearing vegetation and leveling particularly uneven sections. Larger foundation logs stabilize the soft ground where necessary. Across these supports, carefully split planks create a relatively even walking surface. Wooden pegs driven into the underlying soil help prevent movement. In some places, bundles of brushwood reinforce especially unstable areas before heavier timbers are added. Every decision reflects generations of practical experience rather than abstract engineering theory. Remarkably, the finished roadway does not always aim for perfection. Certain sections remain narrow enough that only single-file movement is possible. Other stretches undulate gently with the natural contours beneath them. Instead of forcing the environment into rigid geometric order, the builders cooperate with it. The road becomes a negotiated compromise between human intention and natural limitation. This flexibility may explain why many trackways remain functional for surprisingly long periods despite constant environmental pressures. Labour organisation offers another fascinating glimpse into these societies. A project extending hundreds of metres cannot be completed by one household alone. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of individuals contribute at different stages. Some cut timber, others shape planks. Skilled craftspeople produce stone tools requiring regular maintenance throughout construction. Younger members gather food, firewood, and water for work crews. Elderly individuals may supervise familiar routes or preserve traditional knowledge regarding seasonal flooding. Every member of the community participates according to ability. This cooperation suggests leadership, though perhaps not in the form familiar from later kingdoms. Archaeological evidence indicates increasing social complexity during the Neolithic, yet clear signs of rigid political hierarchies remain limited in many regions. Leadership may have depended more upon reputation, experience, kinship, or specialized knowledge than inherited authority. The successful completion of a major roadway demonstrates not necessarily centralized government, but strong communal organization capable of coordinating ambitious collective projects. One lesser-known clue emerges from the precision of dendrochronology, the dating of wood through tree rings. At several prehistoric trackway sites, analysis shows that many trees were felled during the same season, sometimes within the same year. Such coordinated harvesting implies careful planning rather than gradual construction spread randomly across decades. Communities appear to organize concentrated building efforts, mobilizing substantial labor over relatively short periods when environmental conditions prove favorable. The builders also understand maintenance. Wooden roads crossing wetlands cannot simply be abandoned after completion. Floods shift supporting sediments. Individual planks loosen under repeated use. Vegetation grows across the surface. Evidence from several sites suggests repairs and modifications occurring long after the original construction. Travelers continue relying upon these routes, making periodic maintenance an accepted responsibility rather than an exceptional event. Beyond practical necessity, the road almost certainly carries social meaning. Regular movement strengthens relationships between neighbouring settlements. Seasonal gatherings become easier to organise. Marriage networks expand as travel becomes more reliable. Ceremonial events attract participants from wider regions. Ideas, technologies, and stories spread alongside physical goods. Every journey reinforces connections that gradually transform scattered communities into broader cultural landscapes. Some archaeologists also point to intriguing evidence that certain trackways lead toward wetlands where valuable objects were deliberately deposited. Polished axes, decorated pottery, animal remains, and occasionally human remains have been recovered from waterlogged contexts across prehistoric Europe. Scholars still debate whether these represent ritual offerings, symbolic boundaries, or practices with meanings now lost. The evidence remains incomplete, but it suggests that roads may have connected not only settlements, but places invested with profound cultural significance. Seen through this wider lens, the impossible road becomes something much greater than a practical crossing. It embodies confidence in cooperation, belief in continuity, and deep familiarity with an environment that modern observers can scarcely imagine. Every timber laid into the marsh reflects an assumption that tomorrow's travellers will need this path just as much as today's. The builders cannot foresee the rising waters, changing climates, and shifting coastlines that will eventually erase almost everything surrounding their achievement. For them, the road is not an extraordinary monument. It is simply part of the world they expect to last. A road built across solid ground demands determination. A road built across a living marsh demands understanding. Beneath every preserved timber lies an environment that never truly stands still. Water rises and falls with the seasons. Soft peat slowly compresses under weight. Hidden pools shift beneath dense vegetation. What appears stable in one month may become nearly impassable in the next. The greatest achievement of the builders is not simply that they crossed this landscape, but that they learned to work with forces that could never be completely controlled. Modern engineers begin projects with soil surveys, satellite imagery, mathematical models, and heavy machinery capable of reshaping entire landscapes. Prehistoric builders possessed none of these tools. Their surveys consist of generations of observation. Children grow into adults while watching floods reshape familiar banks. Hunters memorize patches of firm ground hidden beneath reeds. Farmers notice where livestock sink after heavy rain, and where the earth remains surprisingly stable, even during the wettest seasons. Over decades, practical experience becomes an invisible map more detailed than any drawn on paper. Choosing the precise route is therefore one of the most important engineering decisions. A shorter crossing may require constant repairs if it passes over unstable ground. A slightly longer path following natural ridges beneath the marsh could remain usable for generations. Archaeological excavations often reveal that ancient trackways curve gently instead of following perfectly straight lines. At first glance, these bends may seem inefficient, but they usually reflect careful adaptation to conditions hidden below the surface. The builders also understand that different woods behave differently. Oak, with its dense grain and natural resistance to decay, frequently forms the main structural elements. Alder performs well in permanently wet conditions because its submerged wood hardens rather than weakens. Hazel provides flexible branches suitable for woven reinforcements. Birch, lighter and easier to work, serves other specialized purposes. Every species growing within the surrounding forest offers distinct advantages, and experienced craftspeople know precisely where each should be used. Harvesting these materials is itself an exercise in remarkable efficiency. Stone axes polished over countless hours hold surprisingly sharp edges. Experimental archaeologists using replica tools have demonstrated that skilled workers can fell mature trees far faster than many people imagine. Even so, each tree represents a significant investment of time and energy. Poor planning would waste both labor and valuable resources. Evidence from preserved sites suggests that builders often selected trees of similar size, indicating standardized construction rather than random improvisation. Once the timber reaches the construction site, another challenge begins. Freshly cut logs are heavy, especially when saturated with moisture. Marshland offers little stable footing for transporting such loads. It is likely that the builders exploit seasonal opportunities whenever possible. During colder months, partially frozen ground provides firmer support. During wetter periods, floating logs along shallow channels may reduce the effort required. Scholars still debate which methods dominate at different locations, but the archaeological evidence consistently points toward careful adaptation rather than brute force alone. The foundation of the road deserves particular attention. Simply laying planks on soft mud would result in rapid sinking, as repeated footsteps compress the underlying peat. Instead, many prehistoric trackways begin with larger longitudinal beams placed parallel to the direction of travel. Cross planks rest upon these supports, distributing weight across a wider surface. In especially unstable sections, layers of brushwood branches or bundled vegetation create additional stability before heavier timbers are added. These techniques resemble principles still recognized in modern geotechnical engineering, although developed entirely through practical observation. Water itself becomes both an enemy and an ally. Excessive movement of flowing water threatens to undermine structures, yet permanently saturated conditions preserve buried timber for thousands of years once oxygen is excluded. Ironically, the very environment that challenged the builders eventually protects their work long after the society that created it disappears. Had the road remained on dry land, almost every trace would likely have decayed centuries ago. One fascinating detail emerges when archaeologists examine the surfaces of surviving planks. Many display clear marks left by repeated footsteps and the dragging of heavy loads. In certain places, repairs overlay older sections, revealing decades of continued use. Individual boards may have been replaced while the broader structure remained intact. This maintenance reflects a practical understanding that infrastructure is never truly finished. Like any valuable asset, it demands ongoing attention. The width of these roads varies considerably. Some are broad enough for several people to walk side by side, while others allow only a single traveller at a time. Narrower trackways likely reduce the amount of timber required without sacrificing functionality. In dangerous marshes, orderly movement may actually improve safety. Travellers naturally follow one another along the most stable route, avoiding the temptation to step onto uncertain ground, where hidden pools or deep mud could prove hazardous. Engineering decisions also reflect changing seasons. During dry summers, sections of marsh may temporarily become easier to cross without constructed surfaces. Yet winter rains or spring floods quickly erase these advantages. A permanent roadway guarantees reliability regardless of seasonal fluctuations. For communities dependent upon transporting food, livestock, tools, or harvested crops, predictable movement can mean the difference between abundance and hardship. The remarkable durability of some trackways hints at another important characteristic of their builders' patience. Constructing a road across wetlands is unlikely to produce immediate rewards. Weeks or months of labour precede its first practical use. The willingness to invest so heavily in future convenience suggests societies thinking beyond the immediate present. Families expect to remain in the region. Children will inherit familiar settlements. Neighboring communities will continue exchanging goods and knowledge. The road represents confidence that tomorrow will resemble today closely enough for long-term planning to make sense. Archaeologists occasionally discover evidence of surprisingly precise craftsmanship. Planks fit together with minimal gaps. Pegs are driven at consistent intervals. Support beams remain carefully aligned over considerable distances. None of this requires written mathematics or formal engineering schools. Instead, it reflects the accumulated expertise of skilled craftspeople whose knowledge passes directly from one generation to the next through observation and repeated practice. Much of this intellectual tradition leaves no physical trace except the quality of the finished work itself. There is also evidence that builders understood how landscapes evolve over time. Some roads are deliberately elevated above surrounding ground, anticipating gradual subsidence or seasonal flooding. Others incorporate repairs that raise the walking surface after years of use. These modifications suggest continuous monitoring rather than passive acceptance. Communities watch their environment closely, responding to subtle changes long before they become catastrophic. No single explanation fully accounts for every prehistoric roadway uncovered across Europe. Local conditions differ enormously. A technique effective in one marsh may fail completely elsewhere. This diversity is itself revealing. Rather than copying identical designs across vast regions, builders develop flexible engineering traditions tailored to specific environments. Innovation spreads through shared ideas, but implementation always depends upon intimate local knowledge. Standing on one of these reconstructed trackways today, surrounded by quiet reeds or open peatland, it is tempting to focus only on the physical structure beneath one's feet. Yet the true achievement lies in the invisible understanding embedded within every timber. The builders read water, soil, wood, weather, and seasons with extraordinary precision. Their engineering emerges not from domination of nature, but from careful partnership with it. Every successful crossing reflects centuries of accumulated experience distilled into practical solutions that appear deceptively simple. That quiet mastery allows the road to become far more than a technical accomplishment. It transforms dangerous marsh into familiar territory, uncertain journeys into routine travel, and isolated settlements into connected communities. Before long, the trackway no longer feels like a remarkable construction at all. It simply becomes part of daily life, carrying countless ordinary footsteps across a landscape whose future still appears as solid as the carefully placed timbers beneath them. Once the road is complete, its greatest purpose is revealed not in the wood itself, but in the endless movement that begins flowing across it. A road without travellers is only a structure. A road used day after day becomes the living artery of an entire society. Every footprint represents a decision, a destination, a relationship, or a necessity. Over years and generations, thousands of journeys transform the carefully built trackway into something far greater than an engineering project. It becomes the thread that quietly binds together a forgotten world. The first travellers each morning are likely those whose work depends upon the changing rhythms of the landscape. Farmers leave settlements before sunrise to reach distant fields cleared from the surrounding forest. Herdsmen guide cattle towards seasonal grazing areas where higher ground offers fresh vegetation during wetter months. Fishermen carry woven traps towards slow-moving channels, alive with pike, perch, eel, and other freshwater species that sustain communities throughout the year. Hunters disappear beneath the forest canopy following familiar game trails that have existed long before the first cultivated field appeared nearby. Each journey is ordinary, yet together they create a remarkably organized pattern of movement. The road allows daily routines to continue regardless of recent rainfall or rising water levels. Without it, marshland might isolate neighbouring settlements for weeks during particularly wet seasons. With it, communication remains reliable. News spreads, families visit one another, seasonal work continues without dangerous detours through unstable ground. Children also grow up knowing every curve of the trackway. They accompany older relatives carrying baskets, gathering firewood, or helping tend animals. Over time, they learn which stretches become slippery after rain, where birds gather during spring migrations, and where deer often appear at dawn. The road becomes part of memory itself. Long before anyone understands maps in the modern sense, the landscape exists as a sequence of familiar landmarks connected by well-known routes. Trade gradually expands the significance of these crossings far beyond local travel. Archaeological discoveries reveal that prehistoric Europe is surprisingly interconnected. Flint extracted from one region appears hundreds of kilometers away. Jadeite axes crafted from alpine stone reach communities that never glimpse the mountains from which the raw material originates. Amber collected along Baltic shores moves southward through exchange networks, stretching across much of the continent. Copper and later bronze begin reshaping economies as metallurgy slowly spreads. None of these movements require massive caravans resembling those of later civilizations. Instead, valuable objects pass gradually from community to community, carried by countless ordinary travelers. The impossible road plays a quiet but essential role within this larger network. Merchants in the modern sense may not yet exist, but exchange certainly does. A family possessing surplus grain can trade with neighbours specialising in polished stone tools. Skilled potters exchange finely made vessels for hides or livestock. Salt, precious because of its role in preserving food, travels considerable distances wherever natural deposits occur. Every reliable route increases opportunities for cooperation and reduces the risks associated with isolation. One of the most fascinating aspects of prehistoric exchange is that ideas travel alongside physical goods. A new style of pottery decoration, an improved method of shaping axes, or a more efficient farming technique can spread gradually across enormous regions without armies or centralized governments. Each traveler carries not only material objects, but also observations, stories, and practical knowledge gathered from distant settlements. The road, therefore, becomes an invisible channel through which culture itself continuously evolves. Marriage networks provide another powerful reason for regular travel. Archaeological and genetic evidence increasingly suggest that many prehistoric communities avoid remaining completely isolated. Individuals often leave their birth settlements to join neighbouring groups, strengthening social ties, while reducing the risks associated with small, closely related populations. Weddings become more than private family events. They reinforce alliances, encourage cooperation, and extend networks of mutual support across entire landscapes. The impossible road quietly carries generations of people, beginning entirely new lives. Seasonal gatherings likely add another layer to this movement. Certain locations appear to attract repeated visits over centuries. These may serve as places for communal feasting, exchange ceremonies, or collective decision-making. Excavations at several prehistoric sites reveal unusually large quantities of animal bones, pottery fragments, and evidence of temporary occupation consistent with periodic gatherings rather than permanent settlement. Scholars still debate the precise purposes of these events, but what survives in the archaeological record suggests communities regularly came together on a scale exceeding everyday village life. Such gatherings reinforce shared identity across surprisingly broad regions. People who spend most of the year living in relatively small settlements periodically encounter distant relatives, exchange partners, and skilled craftspeople from other communities. Songs, rituals, decorative traditions, and technological innovations circulate through these encounters. The road, thus silent itself, becomes one of the essential instruments, allowing this cultural exchange to flourish. Religion or spirituality almost certainly influences movement as well, even if its details remain frustratingly elusive. Water occupies a special place in many prehistoric landscapes. Rivers, lakes, springs, and wetlands frequently receive carefully deposited objects whose placement appears intentional rather than accidental. Polished axes, decorated pottery, animal remains, and occasionally human remains are discovered beneath ancient waters. No single explanation fully accounts for these practices, but many archaeologists interpret them as offerings connected to beliefs that leave no written record. If certain wetlands possess sacred significance, roads leading toward them may carry ceremonial importance alongside practical value. Daily life continues regardless of these larger patterns. Women carrying woven baskets filled with harvested grain walk beside children, collecting edible plants from marsh edges. Craftspeople transport unfinished tools requiring specialist attention in neighbouring villages. Hunters return with deer or wild boar carefully divided for distribution among extended families. Elderly travellers move more slowly, relying upon the stable timber surface that reduces the dangers of uneven ground. Every generation leaves its invisible mark through repetition rather than spectacle. The surrounding environment remains equally active. Beavers continue reshaping waterways with remarkable persistence. Birds arrive and depart according to ancient migratory cycles. Floodwaters occasionally cover sections of the marsh before retreating again. Forests slowly advance into abandoned clearings, while newly cultivated fields replace older stands of woodland elsewhere. Human activity becomes one influence among many, rather than complete domination of the natural world. One lesser-known clue to the intensity of movement comes from microscopic analysis of preserved sediment surrounding certain trackways. Repeated foot traffic gradually compresses organic layers, altering the structure of the peat itself. Tiny fragments of plant material become mixed in distinctive ways, allowing researchers to identify zones of prolonged human activity, even where the timber has disappeared. These subtle traces suggest that some roads remain in regular use for remarkably long periods, yet the communities depending upon them are not static. Population slowly grows, farming expands into additional clearings, forest composition changes as trees are harvested for fuel construction and agriculture. New technologies gradually appear. The polished stone axe that once represented cutting-edge craftsmanship eventually shares the landscape with the first metal tools. Progress arrives not as sudden revolution, but as countless small improvements unfolding across centuries. To the people living within this world, the road feels permanent. Children become adults without remembering a time before it existed. Grandparents tell stories of familiar journeys rather than of its construction. Maintenance continues almost unnoticed, just another responsibility inherited alongside fields, livestock, and seasonal traditions. Few likely imagine that the landscape itself could someday vanish. That assumption is understandable. Human memory spans decades. The forces preparing to transform this world operate across centuries and millennia. Rising seas advance so gradually that no single generation witnesses the full extent of change. Rivers shift their courses almost imperceptibly. Wetlands slowly deepen. Peat accumulates year after year beneath every careful footstep. Life continues much as it always has, even as the foundations of that familiar world begin quietly changing beneath the surface. The impossible road has become the heartbeat of a thriving society carrying every ordinary aspect of human existence across a landscape rich with opportunity. Its builders could hardly know that the very environment supporting their success is beginning a transformation that will one day erase villages, forests, fields, and memories alike, leaving only scattered timbers to tell future generations that an entire world once flourished, where silence now reigns. For generations, the changes are almost impossible to notice. A child learns the paths through the marsh, grows old, and teaches those same roots to grandchildren who believe the landscape has always looked this way. A familiar stream bends slightly farther east after a winter of heavy rain. One meadow remains wetter than usual through the summer. A grove of alder trees slowly replaces an older stand of oak. None of these observations seems extraordinary on its own. Nature has always changed. Seasons have always differed. Yet beneath these ordinary variations, larger forces are quietly reshaping the entire region. The end of the Ice Age has never truly finished. Although the great glaciers have long retreated, their influence continues across thousands of years. As vast ice sheets melt, global sea levels steadily rise. The increase is not constant. Some centuries see relatively slow change, while others experience more rapid advances as remaining ice masses collapse into the oceans. Coastal plains that once stretched for many kilometers gradually disappear beneath expanding seas. River mouths migrate inland. Saltwater begins reaching places that had always been fresh. At the same time, the land itself is responding to the disappearance of the immense weight once pressing down upon it. In parts of northern Europe, the Earth slowly rebounds upward in a process known as isostatic uplift. Elsewhere, regions sink slightly as sediments compact or tectonic conditions differ. These opposing movements create an extraordinarily complex pattern of changing coastlines. In some places, new land emerges from the sea. In others, productive lowlands slowly vanish beneath rising tides. The communities living along the Impossible Road understand none of these geological processes in scientific terms, but they observe their consequences with remarkable attention. A crossing that remains dry throughout childhood may require repairs decades later because water now lingers longer after seasonal floods. Fishing grounds shift gradually. Marsh plants expand into areas once suitable for cultivation. Canoes become increasingly useful where people had previously walked with ease. One of the earlier signs of transformation likely appears in the rivers themselves. Rivers are never fixed. They constantly erode one bank while depositing sediment along another. Small changes accumulate over decades until entire channels relocate. What begins as a narrow side stream may eventually become the main course, while older channels fill with reeds and stagnant water. Communities depending upon predictable waterways must adapt continuously, rebuilding landing places and adjusting familiar routes. Peat also plays an unexpectedly important role in this slow transformation. Wetland supports specialized mosses that die, compress and accumulate year after year, without fully decomposing because oxygen remains limited beneath saturated conditions. Over centuries, this process creates thick layers of peat, capable of dramatically altering local topography. Areas that once consist of open pools become solid enough to support vegetation, while neighbouring ground subsides under increasing weight. The landscape never stops evolving. Tree pollen preserved within these growing peat deposits provides one of archaeology's most remarkable environmental records. Layer by layer, microscopic grains settle onto wet surfaces and remain trapped for thousands of years. Scientists examining these sequences observe subtle but significant changes. Oak forests begin declining in some regions. Alder, better adapted to wetter conditions, becomes increasingly common. Later, still pollen from salt-tolerant plants appears where freshwater species once dominated, signalling the gradual advance of marine influence into former inland environments. Human communities respond with flexibility rather than panic. Fields are relocated when necessary. New clearings are opened farther from expanding wetlands. Livestock grazing patterns change with shifting vegetation. The impossible road itself receives additional maintenance as increasingly soft ground threatens its stability. Archaeological evidence from several prehistoric trackways reveals multiple phases of repair, suggesting builders repeatedly invest labour to preserve routes that remain economically and socially important. This persistence demonstrates both resilience and optimism. Repairing a deteriorating road requires confidence that the effort will continue paying dividends for years to come. Every replacement plank represents another commitment to a familiar way of life. Few people likely imagine they are resisting changes extending across entire millennia. From their perspective, they are simply responding to another difficult season, much as previous generations always have. Weather variability may occasionally reinforce the illusion that conditions will eventually return to normal. A sequence of unusually dry summers temporarily stabilizes marshes that had seemed increasingly wet. Productive harvests encourage confidence. Then several exceptionally rainy years reverse those gains almost overnight. Such fluctuations complicate long-term adaptation because temporary improvements mask broader environmental trends. Even modern societies sometimes struggle to distinguish short-term weather from lasting climate change. Prehistoric communities face the same challenge without written records spanning centuries. The forests themselves begin telling a quieter story. Older trees adapted to drier soils become more vulnerable as groundwater levels rise. Storms topple weakened trunks into expanding wetlands. New generations of moisture-loving species gradually dominate lower elevations. Animal populations shift in response. Some hunting grounds become less reliable, while wetlands attract increasing numbers of fish and waterfowl. Opportunities change alongside difficulties. One lesser-known line of evidence comes from preserved insect remains. Certain beetles survive only within very specific habitats. Their appearance or disappearance within archaeological layers allows specialists to reconstruct surprisingly detailed environmental conditions. At several prehistoric wetland sites, changing beetle communities reveal increasing moisture and expanding marsh vegetation. Centuries before complete landscape transformation becomes obvious. Tiny insects, unnoticed by the people living among them, quietly record the advance of profound ecological change. Communities likely adapt socially as well as economically. Travel routes are adjusted. Seasonal calendars evolve to accommodate shifting flood cycles. Knowledge passed from elders grows even more valuable because successful adaptation depends upon recognizing subtle environmental patterns accumulated over lifetimes. The builders of the impossible road are not passive victims awaiting disaster. They actively negotiate with an environment that grows steadily more unpredictable. Still, there are limits to adaptation. Every repair requires additional timber. Every relocated field demands fresh labor. Longer journeys consume more time. As wetlands expand, maintaining connections between settlements becomes increasingly expensive. Decisions that once seemed straightforward grow more complicated with each passing generation. Some smaller communities may gradually relocate to higher ground, while others remain determined to preserve ancestral homes despite mounting challenges. Scholars still debate precisely how individual prehistoric societies perceived these gradual transformations. The evidence remains incomplete because no written testimonies survive. What does endure suggests remarkable continuity, alongside equally remarkable flexibility. Rather than sudden collapse, many regions experience centuries of adjustment, during which old traditions coexist with practical innovation. The impossible road itself embodies this process. It continues functioning because people refuse to abandon it, modifying their engineering whenever changing conditions demand new solutions. Yet nature is quietly approaching a threshold beyond which repairs alone may no longer suffice. Rising seas continue their relentless advance. River systems become increasingly unstable. Wetlands deepen, broaden, and merge. Landscapes that once support thriving settlements begin losing the very foundations upon which those communities depend. The road still carries travellers every day, but each journey now unfolds across a world whose balance is shifting beneath every familiar step. The transformation remains slow enough to escape dramatic notice, yet fast enough that future generations inherit a landscape noticeably different from the one their grandparents knew. The impossible road, once a confident expression of permanence, is gradually becoming a lifeline stretched across an environment entering one of the greatest periods of change since the glaciers first retreated. None of its travellers can yet see the full scale of what is coming, but the earth beneath them has already begun writing the final chapters of the vanished world they call home. For those living through the final centuries of the road's regular use, there is no single day when the world suddenly changes. No messenger arrives with news that the forest will disappear or that familiar marshes will one day lie beneath open water. Instead, change reveals itself through countless small inconveniences that slowly accumulate into an entirely different way of life. Every journey becomes a little less predictable. Every season demands new adjustments. The road still functions, but it no longer feels as effortless as it once did. Morning begins much as it always has. Mist hangs low over the wetlands while the first light filters through stands of alder and willow. Travellers gather with woven baskets, stone tools, fishing gear, or small herds of livestock. The familiar timber path stretches ahead into the marsh, disappearing into reeds that sway gently in the breeze. At first glance, nothing appears unusual. Yet those who have walked this route for decades immediately notice subtle differences. Water now stands deeper beside sections that were once dry. Moss covers planks that rarely remained damp in earlier years. Fresh repairs interrupt older timber, where the original surface has begun to sink. Experience becomes increasingly valuable. Younger travellers follow elders who know precisely where the strongest footing remains. They recognise which sections can safely support heavy loads and which require slower, more careful movement. The road itself has become almost like a living companion whose condition must be constantly observed. Every creak beneath a footstep, every slight tilt of a plank carries information understood by people whose lives depend upon reading the landscape. Maintenance crews likely become a familiar sight. Rather than constructing entirely new routes, communities continue strengthening existing ones. Replacement planks appear where decay has weakened the surface. Additional supports reinforce soft sections that threaten to disappear beneath expanding peat. Brushwood fills newly formed depressions. Every repair reflects determination to preserve connections that remain essential despite mounting environmental challenges. The work is demanding. Trees suitable for construction may now stand farther away as local forests gradually change. Transporting heavy timber requires longer journeys and greater coordination. What once consumed a few days of labour may now require weeks. Yet abandoning the road is not an attractive alternative. Detours across unstable wetlands remain dangerous, particularly for elderly travellers' children or anyone carrying valuable supplies. The surrounding settlements are changing as well. Some houses stand on slightly raised ground where earlier generations rarely worried about flooding. Storage areas become increasingly important because unpredictable weather complicates harvest schedules. Livestock pens are relocated away from waterlogged soils that encourage disease. Small adaptations accumulate throughout daily life, each one reasonable on its own, but collectively revealing a society responding to persistent environmental pressure. Trade continues, though, perhaps less efficiently than before. Goods still move between neighbouring communities, but journeys require more planning. Travellers may pause more frequently to inspect deteriorating sections of the road or wait for favourable weather before attempting difficult crossings. Seasonal exchange becomes increasingly synchronised with environmental conditions. Knowledge of tides, rainfall and river levels grows nearly as important as the goods themselves. One fascinating possibility suggested by archaeological evidence is that people begin using both older and newer routes simultaneously. In several prehistoric landscapes, multiple trackways appear within relatively small areas, some replacing earlier crossings, while others serve different destinations altogether. Scholars still debate whether these represent expanding transportation networks or repeated attempts to adapt to shifting terrain. No single explanation fully accounts for every site, but the evidence suggests remarkable flexibility rather than rigid attachment to a single path. The psychological experience of gradual environmental change is difficult to reconstruct, yet it may have been surprisingly familiar. Modern societies often struggle to recognize slow transformations occurring across decades because each individual year resembles the last. Prehistoric communities likely experience something similar. An unusually wet season is remembered as unfortunate but temporary. A damaged bridge is repaired. A flooded field is replanted elsewhere. Only across several generations does the cumulative scale of change become unmistakable. Children born during this period inherit a landscape already different from that known by their grandparents. They accept expanding marshes as normal because they have never seen the earlier environment. Older members of the community carry memories of drier crossings and forests that no longer exist. Conversations around evening fires may quietly compare present conditions with those of long ago, not as dramatic warnings, but as observations passed from one generation to the next. The wildlife reflects these changing conditions. Waterbirds become increasingly abundant as wetlands expand. Fish populations flourish in newly formed channels, while certain woodland species retreat toward higher ground. Hunters adapt by changing both their techniques and their preferred prey. Communities that once relied heavily upon forest resources may gradually incorporate greater use of aquatic environments. The transition is not simply one of loss, but also of opportunity, though opportunities rarely compensate completely for disappearing landscapes. Archaeological discoveries occasionally capture poignant glimpses of these final generations. A broken wooden tool left beside a repaired section of trackway suggests hurried work interrupted by changing conditions. Animal footprints preserved alongside human ones reveal livestock still being guided across crossings that required constant attention. Fragments of pottery dropped into wet ground during routine travel become silent reminders of lives continuing almost normally despite mounting environmental uncertainty. One lesser-known clue comes from wear patterns on surviving timbers. Some planks show heavy traffic concentrated toward one edge rather than evenly across the entire surface. Researchers suggest that travellers may have instinctively favoured the most stable portions of deteriorating walkways, gradually creating distinctive patterns of erosion. Such details offer rare insights into individual behaviour preserved across thousands of years. Not every community responds in the same way. Some likely relocate before conditions become too difficult. Others remain investing increasing effort into preserving ancestral settlements. Archaeology often reveals both continuity and abandonment occurring within relatively short distances of one another. Human decisions are shaped by local geography, available resources, family connections, and countless factors that no longer survive in the archaeological record. As sea levels continue rising, another subtle transformation begins affecting everyday experience. Storm surges occasionally push saltwater farther inland than before. Plants adapted to freshwater conditions decline in low-lying areas. Drinking water sources require greater care. Fields closest to the coast become less productive as saline conditions slowly alter the soil. None of these changes alone forces immediate abandonment, but together they steadily erode the stability upon which settled life depends. The impossible road now carries more than people and goods. It carries uncertainty itself. Every journey becomes a quiet negotiation between memory and reality. Travelers still recognize the familiar route, yet they also understand that the landscape surrounding it no longer behaves exactly as it once did. The road remains dependable because communities continue repairing it, but its future increasingly depends upon environmental forces beyond human control. What survives in the archaeological record suggests extraordinary resilience rather than sudden collapse. These people do not simply surrender their world, they adapt repeatedly, displaying ingenuity equal to that shown by the original builders generations earlier. Yet resilience has limits. There comes a point when the cost of preserving familiar routes exceeds the benefits they provide. Rising waters, expanding wetlands, and shifting coastlines are slowly approaching that threshold. For now, however, the road still echoes with ordinary life. Children laugh while balancing along weathered planks. Hunters return carrying game from distant forests. Farmers lead livestock across familiar crossings, before evening mist settles once again over the marsh. Few realize that they belong to the last generations who will experience this landscape as a connected world. Long after their footsteps fade, the road itself will remain buried beneath layers of peat and sediment, waiting silently for thousands of years until another civilization uncovers the forgotten path that once linked an entire vanished land. There is no single flood that swallows the vanished world in one dramatic afternoon. There is no towering wall of water racing across the landscape, while entire communities flee toward distant hills. Popular imagination often favors catastrophes because they are easy to picture and easy to remember. The geological record tells a more complicated story. The disappearance of the world crossed by the impossible road is not the result of one event alone. It is the outcome of centuries of interacting forces, each one subtle enough to appear manageable, yet together powerful enough to erase an entire landscape from human experience. The sea is the most relentless of those forces. After the great ice sheets continue melting across the northern hemisphere, global oceans steadily rise. The increase may average only a small amount over the course of a single lifetime, but over many centuries the effect becomes enormous. Low-lying plains begin shrinking almost imperceptibly. River mouths migrate farther inland. Coastal marshes expand. Islands become smaller before eventually disappearing altogether. Ground that once supported villages slowly spends more days each year beneath water than above it. To people living through these changes, the transformation rarely appears dramatic. Instead, it feels like a series of difficult decisions repeated across generations. A fishing camp is moved slightly inland after repeated flooding. A storage building is rebuilt on higher ground. Fields that once produced dependable harvests become increasingly unreliable as saltwater reaches farther upstream. Every adaptation solves an immediate problem while quietly acknowledging that the landscape has changed once again. One of the greatest casualties is predictability. Human societies flourish when seasons behave within familiar limits. Farmers know when rivers usually flood. Fishermen understand where fish gather during different times of year. Hunters recognize migration routes that remain relatively stable from one generation to the next. As environmental systems become increasingly unstable, This accumulated knowledge loses some of its reliability. Traditional experience still matters, but nature begins following new patterns. The rivers themselves become agents of transformation. As sea levels rise, rivers slow near their mouths because they must flow into increasingly elevated coastal waters. Sediment that would previously have been carried farther out begins accumulating inland. Channels become clogged. New branches develop while older ones fill with mud. Floodplains expand. Wetlands spread into forests that had stood for centuries. Entire valleys gradually become mosaics of shallow lakes, reed beds, and peat bogs. From above, the landscape would resemble a living organism constantly rearranging its own circulatory system. Communities depending upon these waterways face difficult choices. Canoes become more useful in some regions, while traditional paths disappear beneath expanding marshes. The impossible road once crossing a relatively stable wetland now serves a landscape whose boundaries shift from decade to decade. Maintaining the route becomes increasingly demanding, because the ground beneath it no longer behaves as it once did. Archaeologists occasionally uncover evidence that sections of ancient trackways were abandoned while neighbouring portions remained in use. This pattern suggests that people responded selectively rather than abandoning entire transportation networks at once. They rerouted where possible, they repaired where practical, they adapted continuously. Yet every adaptation required labour. Labour meant food. Food meant stable harvests. Stable harvests depended upon an environment becoming steadily less predictable. The balance slowly tilted against the people who had once mastered this remarkable landscape. One fascinating but often overlooked factor involves peat growth itself. As wetlands expand, layers of partially decayed vegetation accumulate year after year. Over centuries, peat can grow several meters thick, burying earlier ground surfaces beneath dense organic deposits. Houses disappear beneath it. Forests become entombed where they once stood. Entire stretches of the impossible road gradually sink from sight, not because they collapse, but because the landscape slowly builds upward around them. This process helps explain one of archaeology's greatest surprises. When modern excavations expose preserved forests beneath peatlands, investigators sometimes find tree stumps still standing upright, exactly where they grew thousands of years earlier. Their roots remain anchored in ancient soil, while meters of peat rest above them. These ghost forests offer astonishing evidence that landscapes now appearing completely natural, once supported thriving woodland ecosystems. The road belongs to that same hidden world. It is not simply buried beneath dirt. It is buried beneath the accumulated remains of thousands of years of changing ecosystems. Another force arrives from the sea itself. Powerful storms periodically reshape coastlines with remarkable speed. Although the long-term trend remains gradual sea level rise, individual storm surges can suddenly erode large areas of vulnerable shoreline. Sand barriers protecting inland wetlands are breached. Saltwater rushes into freshwater systems. Channels widen dramatically after only a few days of violent weather. Modern coastal regions still experience similar processes. Entire beaches can disappear after a single storm. Barrier islands migrate. River mouths shift. Cliffs collapse. When such events occur repeatedly across centuries within already vulnerable landscapes, they accelerate transformations already underway. Scholars continue debating the relative importance of sudden events compared with slow environmental change. No single explanation fully accounts for every prehistoric coastal landscape. In some regions, gradual flooding dominates the evidence. Elsewhere, geological records suggest episodes of rapid marine intrusion, following particularly powerful storms or regional environmental thresholds. One event frequently discussed by researchers is the enormous submarine landslide known as the Storegga Slide, which occurred off the coast of present-day Norway around 8,000 years ago. This collapse generated a powerful tsunami that affected coastlines across parts of northern Europe. Evidence indicates that waves reached areas bordering the North Sea, although their precise impact varied considerably from place to place. Popular accounts sometimes portray this tsunami as the single disaster that destroyed entire prehistoric civilizations. The archaeological evidence does not support such a simple conclusion. The tsunami almost certainly caused significant local devastation where it struck vulnerable coastlines. Some settlements may have been destroyed outright. Others were probably abandoned afterward. Yet most researchers view it as one episode within a much longer story of environmental transformation, rather than the sole cause of a vanished world. In many ways, this interpretation is even more remarkable. Human communities were not defeated by one overwhelming catastrophe. They were challenged by centuries of continuous change. Generation after generation adapted successfully enough that life continued far longer than might seem possible. Eventually, however, adaptation encountered unavoidable limits. Certain settlements became too difficult to maintain. Transportation routes required more repairs than communities could reasonably provide. Agricultural land diminished. Reliable fresh water became harder to secure near expanding coastlines. Families gradually relocated toward higher elevations where conditions offered greater stability. Abandonment rarely occurred all at once. One village emptied while another survived for another century. One crossing remained active while another disappeared beneath reeds. The impossible road slowly lost the travellers who had given it purpose. Without constant maintenance, nature reclaimed it surprisingly quickly. Wooden pegs loosened. Support beams settled deeper into saturated ground. Floodwaters deposited fresh sediment across neglected surfaces. Reeds spread over abandoned sections. Peat moss quietly continued its relentless work, adding millimetre upon millimetre each year, until the ancient walkway vanished completely beneath living vegetation. Within only a few generations, children born in nearby communities may no longer have known the road had ever existed. Within a few centuries, even oral memory faded. The route that had once connected villages, families, ceremonies, and trade became part of a landscape with no visible sign of human engineering. Above it, forests changed. Wetlands deepened. Coastlines retreated. Eventually, in some places, the sea itself advanced over territories where countless people had once walked with complete confidence. The impossible road had not failed. Its builders had not forgotten how to maintain it. Instead, the entire world it was designed to serve had quietly disappeared. What remained was a hidden skeleton beneath the earth, preserved by the very waters that had helped erase its civilization. Thousands of years later, when archaeologists finally uncovered those ancient timbers, they were not merely discovering an old pathway. They were opening the first surviving doorway into a landscape that history had almost succeeded in making completely invisible. For nearly 5,000 years, the impossible road exists in complete darkness. No footsteps pass across its weathered planks. No fires burn at either end of the crossing. Birds nest above it without any awareness that carefully shaped timber lies hidden beneath layers of peat. Trees grow, die, and fall. Entire forests appear and disappear. Kingdoms rise across Europe, build castles, wage wars, and vanish into history, while the ancient roadway remains sealed below the ground, untouched by sunlight, and almost entirely forgotten. Its survival depends upon an extraordinary accident of chemistry. Most wooden structures built by ancient people disappear because oxygen allows fungi, bacteria, and insects to consume organic material. Under normal conditions, even the strongest oak eventually decays into soil. Beneath permanently waterlogged peat, however, oxygen becomes extremely scarce. The organisms responsible for decomposition cannot function normally. Instead of rotting away, the timber enters an environment that slows decay so dramatically that individual tool marks remain visible thousands of years later. Ironically, the landscape that once overwhelmed the road now becomes its greatest protector. The first hints of its survival usually appear by chance rather than through planned archaeological expeditions. A farmer digging drainage channels notices unusually straight pieces of dark wood beneath the peat. Workers extracting peat for fuel encounter heavy planks lying far below the modern surface. Construction crews widening roads or laying pipelines expose rows of ancient timbers that seem far too organized to be natural. In many cases, the discoverers initially assume they have found relatively recent structures, perhaps the remains of forgotten bridges or old agricultural crossings. Only careful investigation reveals something much older. One of archaeology's greatest strengths lies in recognizing patterns invisible to casual observation. A single preserved plank proves little. A sequence of parallel timbers spaced at regular intervals tells an entirely different story. When excavation continues and more of the structure emerges, researchers begin realizing they are standing on an engineered trackway built thousands of years before written history reached the region. The excitement surrounding such discoveries is difficult to overstate. Stone tools are impressive. Ancient pottery offers valuable information. Even isolated wooden artifacts are relatively rare. But an entire prehistoric road preserved in place provides something exceptionally unusual. It captures human movement frozen within its original landscape. Instead of recovering isolated objects separated from their surroundings, archaeologists encounter infrastructure still lying exactly where its builders placed it. Excavation proceeds with extraordinary caution. Waterlogged wood is remarkably stable while buried beneath wet peat, but once exposed to air it begins deteriorating almost immediately. Conservators therefore work closely alongside archaeologists from the very beginning. Timbers are kept constantly moist. Protective coverings shield exposed sections from direct sunlight. Detailed photographs, laser scans, and precise measurements record every element before any pieces are removed for conservation. Sometimes excavation reveals surprises extending far beyond the road itself. Animal footprints appear beside the trackway. Fragments of woven baskets emerge from nearby sediments. Wooden tools, plant fibers, leather objects, and discarded food remain survive in astonishing condition because the same oxygen-poor environment protects them all. Every discovery expands understanding of the vanished landscape surrounding the roadway. One of the most remarkable finds at several prehistoric wetland sites consists of preserved footprints. Unlike fossilized dinosaur tracks formed in stone, these are impressions left by ordinary human feet in soft mud thousands of years ago. Later flooding and sediment preserve them before erosion can erase their delicate forms. Some belong to adults carrying heavy loads. Others are unmistakably those of children. In rare cases, archaeologists can even estimate the direction of travel. For a brief moment, immense spans of time seem to collapse. The impossible road no longer belongs to anonymous prehistory. It belongs to specific people, someone with unusually long strides, a child walking beside an old companion, a traveller leading livestock across unstable ground. Although their names will never be known, their presence becomes unexpectedly personal. Dating the road accurately presents another fascinating challenge. Unlike stone monuments, wooden structures contain one enormous scientific advantage. Trees record their own history through annual growth rings. Dendrochronology allows specialists to compare ring patterns from preserved timbers with established regional chronologies. When enough rings survive, researchers can sometimes determine the exact year and occasionally even the season in which a tree was felled. Such precision would have astonished earlier generations of archaeologists. Instead of saying a road was built about 5,000 years ago, they may identify construction within an extremely narrow time frame. Even when tree ring dating proves impossible, because too few rings remain, radiocarbon analysis provides independent confirmation. Tiny samples of preserved wood undergo careful laboratory testing that estimates their age based upon the decay of radioactive carbon isotopes. Together, these methods transform mysterious wooden planks into securely dated engineering projects. Yet the road itself represents only part of the story. Equally important is reconstructing the vanished environment surrounding it. This requires an extraordinary collaboration among specialists. Palynologists examine fossil pollen preserved within peat. Geologists analyze sediment layers. Botanists identify ancient seeds. Zoologists study animal bones. Entomologists investigate preserved insects. Chemists measure subtle changes in soil composition. Each discipline contributes a different piece to an environmental puzzle, extending across thousands of years. One microscopic pollen grain cannot reveal much. Millions of pollen grains sampled through successive layers create a remarkably detailed history of changing vegetation. Similarly, one insect wing offers limited information. Entire insect communities reveal temperature, moisture, grazing conditions, and vegetation with surprising accuracy. Modern archaeology increasingly resembles environmental detective work rather than simple treasure hunting. One lesser-known technique involves analyzing ancient DNA preserved within sediments themselves. Recent advances allow researchers to recover fragments of genetic material left behind by plants, animals, and even humans without requiring complete bones or visible remains. Sedimentary DNA provides another powerful tool for reconstructing ecosystems that disappeared long ago. Scholars still debate how extensively these methods can transform prehistoric archaeology, but early results are proving remarkably promising. The evidence remains incomplete, yet every new technological advance uncovers additional details hidden within landscapes once thought permanently lost. Sometimes discoveries force researchers to reconsider long-held assumptions. Roads initially believed to serve isolated villages turn out to connect much larger settlement networks. Areas previously interpreted as inhospitable marshes reveal evidence of extensive seasonal activity. Environmental reconstructions demonstrate that landscapes now appearing bleak and empty once supported extraordinary biological richness. Each new excavation subtly reshapes understanding of prehistoric Europe. Perhaps the greatest surprise is how sophisticated these communities increasingly appear. The impossible road is no longer viewed as an isolated curiosity. Instead, it joins a growing body of evidence showing that prehistoric societies planned ambitious construction projects, managed complex environments, maintained extensive exchange networks, and adapted creatively to changing climates. They left no written chronicles praising their accomplishments. Their engineering survives because nature accidentally preserved it. Visitors standing beside reconstructed sections of these ancient trackways often experience an unexpected emotional reaction. The timbers themselves seem modest. There are no towering walls or elaborate carvings. No royal inscriptions proclaim glorious victories. Yet the simplicity is precisely what makes the discovery so powerful. This was not a monument built to impress future generations. It was an ordinary road created for ordinary people. Parents carrying children, farmers transporting harvests, craftspeople visiting neighbouring settlements, hunters returning home before nightfall. Everyday life, rather than spectacular ceremony, shaped its construction. That quiet humanity bridges the enormous gulf separating modern observers from the vanished world beneath their feet. The impossible road waited patiently through thousands of years, until science developed the tools needed to recognize its true significance. Once uncovered, it revealed something far greater than an ancient engineering achievement. It demonstrated that entire landscapes and the countless ordinary lives lived within them can disappear so completely that only a few preserved timbers remain to remind humanity that another world once existed exactly where the present one now stands. Once the impossible road emerges from the peat, the real investigation only begins. The timbers themselves answer one question while immediately creating dozens more. When was the road built? How long did people use it? What kind of forest supplied the wood? What climate surrounded its construction? Did nearby communities farm, hunt, trade, or combine all of these ways of life? Every preserved plank becomes less an artifact than a page from a history book, written in materials rather than words. The remarkable aspect of modern archaeology is that almost nothing recovered from a site is examined in isolation. A single piece of oak tells one story. The soil clinging to its surface tells another. Tiny seeds trapped between wooden boards reveal what plants grew nearby. Fragments of charcoal hint at fires that may have cleared surrounding woodland. Microscopic traces of fungi indicate whether timber was freshly cut or had already begun to decay before construction. Even grains of sand lodged beneath support beams help reconstruct ancient flooding events. One of the first tasks facing researchers is identifying the trees themselves. Species identification is more important than it might initially appear. Different trees thrive under different environmental conditions. Oak generally favours relatively well-drained soils, while alder flourishes in wetter ground. Ash, elm, lime, hazel and birch each occupy particular ecological niches. By identifying which species were selected and comparing them with preserved pollen records, scientists reconstruct not only what people chose to build with, but also the appearance of the surrounding forest. The evidence often reveals deliberate selection rather than simple convenience. Builders repeatedly choose timber with properties best suited to specific structural roles. Straight oak trunks become major supports. Smaller branches reinforce unstable sections. Flexible brushwood fills gaps where heavier beams alone would sink. Such choices demonstrate accumulated practical knowledge extending across generations. These communities understand their forests in extraordinary detail because their survival depends upon them. Tree rings add another remarkable layer of information. Each ring reflects 1 year of growth influenced by rainfall, temperature, sunlight, and local environmental conditions. Narrow rings may indicate drought or competition from neighbouring trees. Wider rings suggest more favourable years. By comparing ring patterns among many timbers, dendrochronologists build overlapping chronologies that sometimes extend back several thousand years. Occasionally, the results become astonishingly precise. At certain prehistoric trackway sites, researchers determine that numerous trees were felled within the same winter season. Such evidence suggests coordinated construction rather than gradual building over decades. Entire communities may have organized large work efforts during carefully chosen periods, when frozen or firmer ground made transporting heavy timber easier. Radiocarbon dating provides another essential tool, particularly when tree ring sequences remain incomplete. Tiny samples of preserved wood seeds or bone undergo laboratory analysis, measuring the decay of radioactive carbon. The resulting dates rarely identify an exact year, but they establish reliable chronological ranges that can be compared with other archaeological evidence. When multiple independent methods converge upon similar conclusions, confidence grows that researchers are accurately reconstructing the timeline of construction and use, yet understanding the road requires far more than dating timber. The vanished landscape itself must also be recovered. This is where pollen analysis becomes one of archaeology's greatest allies. Every flowering plant releases microscopic pollen grains. Many eventually settle into lakes, wetlands, or peat bogs, where oxygen-poor conditions preserve them for thousands of years. Scientists extract narrow cores from these deposits, effectively creating vertical timelines through ancient environments. The deepest layers represent the oldest landscapes. Higher layers record progressively younger ecological conditions. Examining thousands of pollen grains beneath powerful microscopes reveals forests changing century by century. Oak dominates one period, hazel expands during another. Later increasing alder indicates wetter ground. Eventually cereal pollen appears, providing direct evidence that nearby people cultivated crops. Still later, salt-tolerant vegetation becomes more common as marine influence advances inland. No written history survives from these communities. Their environment writes its own history instead. Seeds preserved within peat offer equally valuable insights. Some belong to cultivated plants such as wheat or barley. Others come from edible wild species gathered seasonally. Together they reveal mixed economies combining agriculture with extensive use of natural resources. Far from abandoning hunting and gathering after adopting farming, many prehistoric communities continue exploiting forests, rivers, and wetlands with remarkable sophistication. Animal remains expand this picture even further. Fish bones identify species inhabiting local waterways. Bird bones reveal seasonal migrations. The remains of domesticated cattle, sheep, pigs, and goats indicate established farming, while red deer, wild boar, beaver, and aurochs remind researchers that wild resources remain critically important. Sometimes cut marks preserved on bones reveal butchering techniques that have not changed dramatically in thousands of years. One particularly fascinating line of evidence comes from insects. Although easily overlooked, insects respond quickly to environmental change and often occupy extremely specialized habitats. Certain beetles thrive only in dry woodland. Others require permanently wet peat. Some depend upon grazing livestock. Still others flourish only in decaying timber or freshwater marshes. When archaeologists recover entire insect assemblages from waterlogged deposits, specialists can reconstruct environmental conditions with remarkable precision. In many cases, insects confirm conclusions already suggested by pollen, while also revealing subtle details invisible through other methods. Chemical analysis introduces another dimension. The isotopic composition of preserved materials sometimes reflects changing water sources, vegetation, or climatic conditions. Sediments record shifts between freshwater and marine influence. Organic compounds trapped within peat reveal ancient fire events, vegetation changes, and periods of increased flooding. No single technique provides all the answers. Instead, dozens of independent methods overlap like pieces of an enormous puzzle. When several different forms of evidence point toward the same conclusion, archaeologists gain increasing confidence that they are reconstructing the vanished world accurately. Even footprints contribute important information. At a few exceptional sites, preserved human and animal tracks occur alongside ancient trackways. Measurements reveal differences in body size, walking speed, and direction of movement. Some individuals appear to carry heavy loads based upon the depth and spacing of impressions. Others move lightly across the surface, perhaps children accompanying adults during ordinary journeys. Such discoveries transform abstract prehistory into something unexpectedly intimate. The impossible road ceases to belong merely to anonymous builders. Instead, it belongs to real people making ordinary decisions during ordinary days. One lesser-known scientific breakthrough involves studying preserved proteins and ancient environmental DNA recovered directly from sediments. Rather than relying solely upon visible artifacts, researchers now detect traces left behind by organisms that disappeared completely. Fragments of DNA from plants, animals, and microorganisms survive under favorable conditions, allowing reconstruction of ecosystems with unprecedented detail. Scholars still debate the full potential of these techniques because contamination and preservation remain important challenges. Nevertheless, each passing decade brings remarkable improvements in the ability to read information hidden within ancient landscapes. The cumulative effect of all this evidence is profound. Earlier generations sometimes imagined prehistoric Europe as a sparsely inhabited wilderness, occupied by scattered bands with limited technological capability. The Impossible Road tells a different story. It reveals communities capable of careful planning, environmental management, coordinated labor, long-distance exchange, and sustained adaptation to changing climates. They understand engineering without mathematics written on parchment. They manage transportation networks without maps. They preserve practical knowledge without books. Their achievements survive not because they sought fame, but because unusual environmental conditions accidentally protected the traces of everyday life. Standing beside the reconstructed timbers today, one can almost forget that each plank is only the visible edge of a much larger discovery. Beneath every preserved board lies an immense archive written in pollen, insects, seeds, sediments, tree rings, footprints, and forgotten forests. Together, these fragile clues allow modern science to resurrect a world erased so completely that without them no one would ever suspect an entire civilization of travelers once crossed the very ground where silence settled for thousands of years. Even after decades of excavation and increasingly sophisticated scientific analysis, the impossible road refuses to surrender all of its secrets. In many ways, every new discovery deepens the mystery rather than resolving it. Archaeologists can determine when certain trees were cut. They can reconstruct the forest that once surrounded the crossing. They can identify changing climates, shifting wetlands, and long-forgotten ecosystems with remarkable precision. Yet the people themselves remain strangely elusive. Their intentions, beliefs, and many of their decisions exist just beyond the reach of the surviving evidence. The first mystery concerns the true extent of the road. Only portions survive. Some sections have been destroyed by centuries of agriculture erosion or modern construction. Others remain buried beneath ground that has never been excavated. Still more may now lie beneath rivers, lakes, or the sea itself. Because archaeology usually investigates only small areas at a time, researchers rarely uncover an entire prehistoric roadway from beginning to end. This creates an immediate challenge. Where exactly did the road begin? Where did it end? The preserved section may represent only a fraction of its original length. In some cases, archaeologists estimate that surviving timbers account for only a small percentage of the complete structure. The remainder has simply vanished either through natural processes or human activity, occurring long after the builders disappeared. Another puzzle involves destination. Modern roads often connect clearly recognizable places, cities, ports, bridges, or settlements. Prehistoric landscapes are far more difficult to reconstruct. A road may lead toward a village that has completely eroded away. It may terminate at a ceremonial site whose wooden structures decayed thousands of years ago. It may connect several seasonal camps that leave almost no archaeological trace. Without complete preservation of the surrounding landscape, determining purpose becomes remarkably difficult. Some trackways appear to link known settlements separated by marshland. Others seem to head toward isolated wetlands where archaeologists discover surprisingly few signs of permanent occupation. Why would communities invest enormous effort constructing substantial roads leading into apparently empty landscapes? Several explanations have been proposed. The simplest is that the destinations have not yet been discovered. Wooden houses built upon slightly elevated ground often leave only faint stains in the soil after thousands of years. Entire villages may remain hidden beneath later deposits awaiting future excavation. Another possibility involves seasonal use. Perhaps certain destinations became important only during particular times of the year. Fishing grounds, hunting territories, temporary grazing areas, places where neighbouring communities gathered for exchange or celebration. If occupation lasted only weeks rather than generations, the archaeological evidence might be extremely subtle. There is also the possibility of ritual significance. Across prehistoric Europe, wetlands repeatedly yield objects that appear deliberately deposited rather than accidentally lost. Beautifully polished stone axes, carefully crafted pottery, decorated weapons from later periods, animal remains, and even complete wooden artifacts have been recovered from rivers, bogs, and lakes. These discoveries have encouraged many researchers to suggest that wetlands occupied an important place within prehistoric belief systems. The road may therefore have connected not only economic destinations but also spiritually significant landscapes. The evidence, however, demands caution. No written traditions survive explaining these practices. Modern interpretations inevitably involve inference. Scholars still debate whether such deposits represent offerings, territorial markers, social ceremonies, practical disposal of valuable objects, or combinations of several different behaviors. No single explanation fully accounts for every discovery. Another enduring mystery concerns who organized construction. The engineering itself demonstrates planning. Timber was selected carefully. Labor was coordinated. Maintenance continued across many years. Yet archaeological evidence reveals surprisingly little about political leadership. Unlike later civilizations, there are no obvious palaces, royal tombs, or monumental administrative centers associated with these roads. Did respected elders organize communal labor? Did influential families coordinate construction? Were projects directed by ritual specialists whose authority combined practical knowledge with spiritual leadership? Or did entire communities cooperate through traditions that required no permanent hierarchy at all? The evidence remains frustratingly incomplete. Genetics introduces another fascinating layer to the mystery. Ancient DNA recovered from prehistoric burials increasingly reveals that Europe experienced repeated waves of migration throughout prehistory. Farming populations arriving from Anatolia mixed with local hunter-gatherers. Later migrations introduced additional genetic diversity across much of the continent. These discoveries demonstrate that prehistoric societies were rarely isolated. People, ideas, and technologies moved across surprisingly large regions. The Impossible Road may therefore have served communities far more culturally diverse than earlier researchers imagined. Yet genetics cannot explain everything. Shared DNA does not automatically reveal shared language. It says little about political organization. It cannot reconstruct myths, songs, ceremonies, or daily conversations. The most human aspects of prehistoric life often leave the fewest archaeological traces. Language itself remains one of the greatest unknowns. The builders certainly spoke. They instructed children. They planned construction. They exchanged knowledge about weather forests and rivers. Yet every word they ever uttered has vanished. Unlike later societies, they leave no inscriptions carved into stone or written upon clay. Their languages disappear completely, surviving only through indirect echoes preserved in human migrations that later shape Europe. Some popular writers have attempted to fill these gaps with dramatic speculation. Lost super-civilizations, forgotten empires possessing advanced technologies, mysterious outsiders teaching engineering to local populations, ancient global networks extending far beyond available evidence. Such ideas attract considerable public attention because they promise simple answers to complex mysteries. Modern archaeology, however, provides little support for these claims. The sophistication of the Impossible Road does not require forgotten advanced civilizations. Experimental archaeology repeatedly demonstrates that prehistoric communities possessed both the practical knowledge and organizational ability necessary to construct such trackways using tools known from the archaeological record. Recognizing their genuine achievements is ultimately far more impressive than attributing them to imaginary outsiders. One particularly persistent misconception involves assuming prehistoric people thought only about immediate survival. The road itself argues strongly against that idea. Its construction required planning extending well beyond a single season. Maintenance continued across generations. Communities invested labor today for benefits expected years into the future. Such behavior reflects strategic thinking every bit as real as that found in later civilizations. The mystery lies not in whether they possessed intelligence equal to modern humans. They unquestionably did. The mystery lies in how they organized knowledge within societies that transmitted almost everything orally. Recent discoveries continue reshaping understanding. LIDAR surveys reveal hidden landscape features beneath forests. Ground-penetrating radar identifies buried structures without excavation. Environmental DNA uncovers previously invisible ecosystems. Improved radiocarbon calibration increases chronological precision. Every technological advance allows researchers to ask questions unimaginable only a few decades earlier. Yet archaeology remains a discipline defined as much by uncertainty as by discovery. Every excavation destroys part of the site it investigates. Careful recording preserves information, but once a trench is opened, the original context can never be replaced. For this reason, many areas surrounding known trackways remain intentionally unexcavated until future techniques become even more powerful. Perhaps the greatest mystery of all concerns how much has already been lost forever. Thousands of prehistoric roads were almost certainly built across Europe. Only a tiny fraction survive. Most decayed naturally. Others were destroyed by agriculture, construction, drainage, or erosion before anyone realized they existed. The impossible road is extraordinary, not because it was unique, but because chance allowed it to endure while countless others disappeared without leaving any visible trace. Every preserved timber therefore reminds archaeologists of an uncomfortable truth. The archaeological record is incomplete by nature. What survives is determined not only by human activity, but by extraordinary accidents of preservation. The vanished world still guards most of its secrets beneath fields, wetlands, forests, and coastal waters that modern people cross every day without suspecting what lies hidden below. The impossible road has answered enough questions to transform understanding of prehistoric societies, yet it continues inviting deeper investigation. It stands as both evidence and enigma, proving that remarkable engineering flourished long before written history, while quietly reminding every generation of researchers that the past will always remain larger than the fragments fortunate enough to survive. The impossible road is not alone. At first, its discovery appears so unusual that it seems to belong to a single remarkable community living in a unique corner of prehistoric Europe. Yet as archaeologists continue investigating ancient landscapes across different countries, a surprising pattern begins to emerge. Again and again, buried beneath peat marshes, river valleys, and forgotten coastlines, traces of similar engineering appear. None are identical, yet together they reveal something profound. Across vast distances, separated by hundreds or even thousands of years, different societies repeatedly confront the same challenge and often arrive at remarkably similar solutions. One of the most famous examples is the Sweet Track in southwestern England. Discovered during peat cutting in the 20th century, this extraordinary wooden walkway stretches across the Somerset Levels, a landscape that today consists largely of wetlands. Tree ring analysis dates its construction with astonishing precision to the late 4th millennium before the Common Era. The builders selected carefully worked oak ash and lime-laying planks across supporting rails to create a stable route over waterlogged ground. When archaeologists first examined the structure, many expected a relatively primitive crossing. Instead, they found evidence of deliberate planning, sophisticated carpentry, and coordinated labour. The Sweet Track demonstrates that prehistoric engineering reached levels rarely imagined only a century earlier. Its builders faced challenges strikingly similar to those encountered by the creators of the impossible road. Nearby lies another remarkable structure known as the Post Track, likely even older than the Sweet Track itself. Together, these discoveries suggest that wetlands were not avoided whenever possible. They were occupied, managed, crossed, and integrated into everyday life. Marshes served not simply as obstacles, but as valuable environments supporting fishing, hunting, gathering, grazing, and travel. Across northern Germany, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Ireland, archaeologists uncover additional prehistoric trackways, built from timber brushwood and carefully arranged logs. Some extend only short distances across particularly difficult terrain. Others continue for hundreds of meters. A few may once have stretched much farther before later destruction erased significant portions. Each discovery reinforces an important realization. These roads are not isolated accidents. They represent an entire engineering tradition. Communities separated by considerable distances understand that reliable movement across wetlands requires deliberate construction, and each develops methods suited to local conditions. The details vary. Available tree species differ. Ground conditions change. Seasonal flooding follows local patterns. Construction techniques evolve through regional experience. Yet the underlying principle remains remarkably consistent. Human beings adapt intelligently to difficult environments using materials immediately available around them. Beyond Europe, similar stories unfold in very different landscapes. In the tropical lowlands of Central America, ancient Maya communities construct elevated causeways known as sacbiob, connecting cities across forests and seasonal wetlands. These limestone roads differ dramatically in appearance from northern European timber trackways, yet they serve familiar purposes, facilitating movement, reinforcing political connections, and linking communities across challenging terrain. Thousands of kilometers away in the Andes, later civilizations engineer extensive mountain roads, traversing some of the most demanding landscapes on Earth. Rather than marshes, they confront steep slopes, high passes, and dramatic changes in elevation. Stone replaces timber, but careful planning, local knowledge, and communal labor remain essential. The comparison is revealing. Engineering solutions differ because environments differ. Human creativity remains constant. Even earlier examples appear elsewhere. Prehistoric communities in parts of northern Europe occasionally reinforce muddy pathways with bundles of brushwood before laying heavier timbers above them. Similar principles appear independently in many regions, where saturated ground threatens ordinary travel. Engineers separated by oceans and millennia repeatedly discover that distributing weight across unstable surfaces dramatically improves mobility. No contact between these societies is required. The landscape itself teaches similar lessons. This phenomenon is sometimes described as convergent innovation. Just as unrelated animal species may independently evolve comparable adaptations when facing similar environmental pressures, human societies often develop analogous technologies while remaining entirely unconnected. The impossible road belongs to this broader history of practical invention. One particularly fascinating comparison involves submerged prehistoric landscapes around the world. Along the coastlines of Japan, Australia, the Mediterranean and Southeast Asia, archaeologists increasingly recognize that enormous areas inhabited during periods of lower sea level now lie underwater. Most remain poorly explored because underwater archaeology presents enormous technical challenges. The North Sea is only one example. During the last ice age and the millennia immediately following it, coastlines around the globe look dramatically different. People settled river valleys now buried beneath continental shelves. They hunted across plains submerged beneath modern seas. Entire cultural landscapes disappeared as rising oceans advanced. The impossible road therefore belongs to a worldwide story of lost coastlines, rather than an isolated regional mystery. Modern underwater archaeology is gradually recovering fragments of these vanished worlds. Fishing vessels occasionally dredge ancient animal bones from the seabed. Divers locate preserved forest beneath coastal waters. Sonar mapping reveals ancient river channels winding across submerged plains. Each discovery reminds researchers how incomplete the archaeological record remains. Much of humanity's earliest settled history now lies beneath oceans that continue concealing its evidence. One lesser-known discovery illustrates this beautifully. Along several European coastlines, fishermen have repeatedly recovered worked flint tools together with bones of mammoths, reindeer, and other Ice Age animals from the seabed. These finds confirm that landscapes now submerged once supported thriving ecosystems inhabited by both animals and humans. Although these artifacts are separated from the impossible road by thousands of years, they reinforce the same fundamental lesson. The modern map is not the map known to prehistoric people. Entire countries of memory have vanished beneath changing seas. Comparisons also reveal differences that are equally important. Some ancient roads become symbols of centralized political power. Roman roads, for example, are carefully surveyed, standardized, and maintained across enormous imperial territories. Their construction reflects state organization, military logistics, and taxation. The Impossible Road represents something quite different. Its builders possess no empire. No written bureaucracy directs construction. Instead, cooperation emerges from local communities whose survival depends upon shared effort rather than imperial administration. This distinction matters. It reminds us that sophisticated infrastructure does not always require king's armies or monumental governments. Communal organization alone can achieve remarkable engineering when knowledge accumulates across generations. Scholars continue debating how much communication existed among prehistoric regions constructing similar trackways. Did ideas spread gradually through exchange networks? Did neighboring communities simply observe successful techniques and adapt them locally? Or were many innovations developed independently in response to comparable environmental conditions? The evidence supports elements of each possibility. Trade certainly connected many regions. Useful ideas undoubtedly traveled alongside valuable goods. At the same time, local experimentation almost certainly produced unique variations suited to specific landscapes. The Impossible Road therefore occupies an important position within the broader history of human ingenuity. It demonstrates that prehistoric societies should never be judged solely by what they lacked. They lacked writing. They lacked metal machinery. They lacked wheeled transport in many cases. Yet they possessed extraordinary observational skills, deep environmental knowledge, cooperative social structures, and practical engineering capable of solving remarkably complex problems. Looking across continents and thousands of years, the pattern becomes unmistakable. Whenever human beings encounter rivers, marshes, mountains, forests, deserts, or frozen tundra, they rarely surrender to geography. Instead, they reshape movement itself. They build, sometimes with stone, sometimes with timber, sometimes with earth, sometimes with woven branches. Every road becomes more than a means of travel. It becomes a declaration that connection matters enough to justify immense collective effort. The Impossible Road is one surviving chapter within that immense global story. Hidden for millennia beneath a vanished landscape, it now stands alongside countless other ancient pathways as evidence that long before written history, humanity was already transforming difficult environments into connected worlds through patience, cooperation, and remarkable practical intelligence. For archaeologists, the Impossible Road is an engineering achievement. For the people who built it, it is something much simpler. It is the path home. Every scientific reconstruction eventually returns to the same unavoidable truth. Beneath the pollen diagrams, tree ring chronologies, sediment cores, and radiocarbon dates lived ordinary human beings whose concerns were rarely extraordinary. They woke before sunrise, worried about weather-repaired tools worn down by constant use, cared for children, prepared meals, and hoped that familiar routines would continue another season. The road mattered because it made those ordinary lives possible. Imagine a late summer morning when mist still clings to the marsh. The first travellers are already moving before the sun rises high enough to warm the wet ground. A farmer balances a woven basket across one shoulder. Behind him walks a younger relative carrying polished stone tools recently sharpened after weeks of harvesting. Their destination is not far away, but without the timber trackway, the journey would require exhausting detours through unstable peat or dangerous crossings where hidden pools wait beneath thick reeds. The road shortens distance, but more importantly, it reduces uncertainty. That difference changes everything. A mother carrying an infant no longer has to fear sinking knee-deep into soft mud while balancing supplies. Elderly members of the community remain connected with neighbouring settlements, long after difficult terrain would otherwise isolate them. Children grow up regarding journeys that once demanded careful planning as ordinary parts of daily life. Infrastructure quietly reshapes society without announcing itself. The people using the road almost certainly stop thinking about its remarkable engineering after only a few years. Just as modern travellers rarely admire every bridge they cross, prehistoric communities quickly accept the trackway as a normal feature of the landscape. It fades into the background of everyday experience. Only later generations, separated by thousands of years, recognize how extraordinary it truly was. The settlements connected by the road are modest by later historical standards. There are no towering walls, no stone palaces, no monumental temples dominating the horizon. Homes are built primarily from timber-woven branches, clay, and thatch gathered from nearby wetlands. Smoke drifts gently through roof openings as meals cook over open hearths. Floors consist of packed earth, covered with reeds or animal skins. Storage pits protect grain harvested during previous seasons. Livestock remain close enough to hear during the night. These villages leave surprisingly little behind. Unlike stone architecture, wood eventually disappears. Thatched roofs collapse. Walls decay. Only darker stains in the soil, scattered post holes, fragments of pottery, animal bones, and discarded tools remain for archaeologists to discover thousands of years later. The road survives better than the houses. In a curious twist of history, the path connecting the community outlives the community itself. Children likely experience the landscape differently from adults. Where experienced travellers notice changing water levels or deteriorating planks, requiring future repairs, children notice dragonflies hovering above pools, birds nesting among reeds, or animal tracks pressed into damp ground beside the walkway. They race along familiar sections until older relatives remind them that heavy baskets require careful balance. Their earliest memories become inseparable from the route stretching across the marsh. Those memories never enter written history, yet they are no less real. One of the most touching discoveries at several prehistoric wetland sites involves footprints. Small footprints, the unmistakable impressions of children preserved beside larger adult tracks. These are not ceremonial moments. They are evidence of ordinary family life continuing across landscapes now lost forever. A child once paused here, another slipped slightly on damp timber. Someone turned back after forgetting a tool. The smallest traces become the most powerful because they reveal lives continuing without any awareness that future civilizations would someday search for evidence of their existence. Food also moves constantly along the road. Fresh fish carried from river channels, hazelnuts collected from woodland edges, baskets filled with berries during late summer, grain harvested from nearby clearings, bundles of reeds gathered for repairing roofs, firewood stacked for approaching winter. Every season changes the rhythm of movement without changing its importance. Autumn probably becomes particularly busy. Communities work urgently to prepare for colder months. Livestock require attention. Crops must be stored before damp weather returns. Hunting opportunities increase as animals move through familiar migration routes. The road carries the products of an entire landscape towards settlements, depending upon careful preparation for winter survival. Work rarely occurs alone. Evidence from prehistoric societies consistently suggests cooperation, extending across extended families and neighbouring communities. Harvests demand many hands. Construction requires coordinated effort. Repairs to the road itself almost certainly become communal responsibilities. Younger members learn practical skills through participation rather than formal instruction. Knowledge passes from observation to imitation. No manuals exist, no engineering schools. Instead, children watch experienced builders replace damaged planks, identify suitable timber, and judge the stability of saturated ground. By adulthood, techniques mastered through years of participation appear completely natural. One lesser-known insight from experimental archaeology strengthens this picture. Modern volunteers attempting to recreate prehistoric woodworking techniques frequently report that success depends less upon physical strength than rhythm coordination and accumulated skill. Stone axes become surprisingly efficient in practiced hands. Splitting timber accurately requires careful observation rather than brute force. Even transporting heavy logs becomes manageable when groups coordinate movement effectively. These experiments remind researchers that prehistoric craftsmanship reflects expertise developed across entire lifetimes. The impossible road embodies thousands of hours of learned experience invisible within the finished structure itself. Community identity may also become closely connected with the crossing. Visitors approaching from neighboring settlements recognize familiar landmarks long before reaching the houses themselves. The road serves as an introduction to the community. Its condition quietly communicates organization, cooperation, and continued occupation. A well-maintained crossing reassures travelers that they are entering an active, connected landscape. As environmental pressures gradually increase, emotional attachment to place likely strengthens. Leaving an ancestral settlement is never simply a practical decision. Fields represent years of labor. Homes contain family memories. Nearby forests preserve familiar hunting grounds. The road itself embodies generations of communal effort. Abandoning such places means leaving behind not only buildings but relationships woven into the landscape itself. Modern archaeology can identify relocation. It struggles to measure grief, yet grief almost certainly existed. Communities watching familiar wetlands expand year after year would have understood that something precious was changing, even if they could not perceive the full geological processes responsible. Some families probably left reluctantly, others stayed as long as possible. Different decisions shaped neighboring communities facing similar environmental pressures. None of these choices survive in written records. Only subtle archaeological patterns hint at them. What survives in the record suggests remarkable resilience rather than despair. People continued building, continued repairing, continued raising children, continued exchanging goods. Life did not stop simply because the landscape became more difficult. The road remained an expression of hope every time new timber replaced old. Each repair declared confidence that tomorrow's travelers would still need the crossing. That quiet optimism makes the impossible road profoundly human. It was never intended to become an archaeological treasure. Its builders sought nothing more ambitious than helping ordinary people move safely across familiar ground. Thousands of years later, that modest goal has unexpectedly preserved one of the clearest windows into prehistoric daily life. The kings, conquerors, and famous rulers who dominate written history often leave monuments celebrating themselves. The people who built the impossible road left something gentler. They left the traces of cooperation, of routine, of families, of neighbors helping neighbors across difficult ground. And in doing so, they preserved a reminder that history is shaped not only by extraordinary individuals, but by countless ordinary footsteps whose quiet persistence carried entire civilizations forward, until the landscape itself finally changed beyond recognition. The impossible road is easy to admire because it survives. What is more difficult to appreciate is the warning hidden beneath it. The ancient builders did almost everything modern observers celebrate. They understood their environment with remarkable precision. They engineered practical solutions using available materials. They cooperated across communities. They adapted repeatedly as conditions changed. For centuries, perhaps even millennia, those adaptations worked. Yet the landscape continued transforming indifferent to every careful repair and every successful harvest. This is not a story about failure. It is a story about limits. Human history often celebrates adaptation as though every challenge can eventually be overcome through enough ingenuity. The archaeological record tells a more balanced story. Innovation extends possibilities. It delays hardship. It creates opportunities where none previously existed. But there are moments when environmental change unfolds across such immense scales that even the most resourceful societies must eventually accept that the world supporting them is becoming a different place. The builders of the impossible road never stop adapting. They relocate fields. They strengthen crossings. They modify seasonal routines. They alter patterns of hunting and fishing. They likely move individual settlements when necessary. Each decision reflects practical intelligence grounded in generations of observation. The remarkable aspect is not that these efforts ultimately prove insufficient. The remarkable aspect is how long they remain effective. Modern climate science increasingly emphasizes that environmental systems rarely change in perfectly smooth, predictable ways. Gradual trends are often interrupted by periods of relative stability, followed by more rapid transitions once certain thresholds are crossed. Archaeologists see similar patterns preserved within prehistoric landscapes. For centuries, wetlands may expand only slowly. Then several unusually wet decades accelerate peat formation. Coastlines retreat almost imperceptibly before a sequence of powerful storms reshapes vulnerable shorelines. River systems remain familiar until accumulated sediment suddenly redirects major channels. These threshold effects make adaptation extraordinarily difficult because yesterday's successful strategy may no longer solve tomorrow's problem. The impossible road becomes a powerful illustration of this challenge. It is repaired repeatedly because repairs continue working, until one day they do not. Not because the builders lose their skills, not because they become less determined, simply because the landscape they're trying to preserve no longer behaves like the landscape inherited from earlier generations. One striking lesson emerging from archaeological research concerns flexibility. Communities that survive longest often appear willing to adjust rather than rigidly defend every tradition. Farming mixes with hunting. Fishing grows more important where wetlands expand. Seasonal movement increases as environmental conditions fluctuate. Rather than following a single economic strategy, prehistoric societies repeatedly diversify their sources of food and security. Modern economists might describe this as resilience through diversification. Ancient people simply called it survival. One lesser-known insight comes from studies of ancient charcoal preserved within peat deposits. Patterns of controlled burning suggest that prehistoric communities actively managed portions of surrounding woodland rather than merely exploiting untouched forests. Fire-open clearings encouraged particular plant species, improved grazing conditions, and facilitated hunting. Far from existing as passive inhabitants of pristine wilderness, these societies continuously shaped local environments. This realization has transformed archaeological thinking over recent decades. Earlier interpretations often portrayed prehistoric Europe as overwhelmingly wild until large-scale agriculture arrived. Increasing evidence instead suggests landscapes already influenced by thousands of years of deliberate human activity. The impossible road belongs within that long tradition of environmental management, yet management differs fundamentally from control. No society, ancient or modern, controls climate. No civilization commands sea level. No engineering project permanently halts geological processes operating across thousands of years. Recognizing these limits does not diminish human achievement. It places that achievement within its proper context. The road succeeds because it works with the landscape rather than attempting to erase it. Its builders understand water instead of simply resisting it. They distribute weight across unstable peat instead of excavating enormous foundations. They select locally available timber, adapted to wet conditions rather than importing unsuitable materials from distant regions. Their engineering philosophy emphasizes cooperation with natural processes. Ironically, this may explain why the road survives as long as it does. Modern societies sometimes imagine technological progress as a continuous movement toward increasing domination of nature. The impossible road suggests another possibility. Perhaps the greatest engineering successes emerge from careful observation, patience, and respect for environmental realities. There is another lesson hidden within the vanished landscape. Civilizations often disappear so gradually that the people living through change never realize they inhabit the final generations of a familiar world. History is full of dramatic endings remembered through written chronicles. Empires collapse, capitals fall, battles decide political futures. The impossible road belongs to a quieter category of disappearance. No historian records its abandonment. No witness describes the last traveller crossing its weathered planks. No document announces that an entire landscape is passing into memory. Instead, absence slowly replaces presence. One family relocates. Another follows several decades later. Maintenance becomes less frequent. Children grow up elsewhere. Eventually, nobody remains to repair the crossing. Silence arrives without ceremony. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout archaeology. Entire settlements vanish without evidence of violent destruction. Trade networks contract gradually. Agricultural fields return to woodland. Rivers occupy former villages. The past often disappears through accumulation rather than catastrophe. Scholars continue debating exactly how different prehistoric communities experience these transitions. The evidence remains incomplete. Some regions appear to retain stable populations despite major environmental change. Others witness significant relocation. Still others reveal repeated cycles of occupation and abandonment depending upon local conditions. Human responses prove remarkably diverse. That diversity itself offers another important lesson. There was never one inevitable outcome. Communities made different decisions based upon geography, available resources, social relationships, and accumulated knowledge. Some adaptations succeeded longer than others. Some failed quickly. History unfolded through countless local choices rather than one universal pattern. Today, the impossible road occupies museums, research papers, documentaries, and archaeological reconstructions. Visitors admire preserved timbers displayed under carefully controlled humidity. Scientists continue refining environmental chronologies using techniques unavailable even 20 years ago. Students learn that prehistoric societies possessed far greater sophistication than earlier textbooks suggested. Yet the road continues offering new insights because every generation asks different questions. Previous researchers focused primarily upon dating. Later investigations emphasized engineering. More recent studies explore ecology, genetics, climate, and human mobility. Future scholars will undoubtedly discover evidence currently invisible, because necessary technologies have not yet been invented. The road's story, therefore, remains unfinished. It continues evolving alongside archaeology itself. Perhaps its most enduring legacy lies in changing how modern people imagine the distant past. Instead of isolated bands wandering through endless wilderness, we now see interconnected communities capable of long-term planning and remarkable cooperation. Instead of primitive engineering, we recognize sophisticated practical knowledge refined through centuries of careful observation. Instead of static landscapes, we understand environments continuously changing alongside the people inhabiting them. The impossible road reminds us that survival has never depended solely upon strength or intelligence. It depends upon the ability to notice change early, cooperate widely, adapt thoughtfully, and recognize when even successful strategies must eventually evolve. Its builders mastered those skills as well as any society could. Their world still disappeared, not because they lacked wisdom, but because time itself was quietly transforming the ground beneath every familiar step, reminding humanity that even our greatest achievements remain part of landscapes whose stories extend far beyond any single civilization. By the time the impossible road finally disappears beneath peat mud and rising water, the world that gave it meaning has already faded. The timber itself lingers beneath the surface for thousands of years, but the society that built it has dissolved into later cultures, changing landscapes and memories that leave no written trace. The road becomes something extraordinary without intending to be. It transforms from a practical piece of infrastructure into one of the rare surviving witnesses capable of telling the story of an entire vanished world. History often remembers civilizations through spectacular monuments. Massive pyramids dominate deserts. Stone temples crown mountain ridges. Great walls stretch across landscapes visible from extraordinary distances. These structures announce themselves with confidence, demanding attention from every generation that follows. The impossible road does the opposite. It hides. It survives because nobody sees it. Covered by wetlands, protected beneath oxygen-poor peat, forgotten beneath fields and marshes, it escapes the destruction that usually claims ancient timber. Its greatest achievement after abandonment is remaining invisible. There is something quietly poetic about that. The builders almost certainly hoped future generations would continue using the crossing. They never imagined that people living 5,000 years later would carefully excavate individual planks beneath scientific tents, while recording every detail with laser scanners and microscopic analysis. Their hopes extended only to children, grandchildren, and perhaps the next several generations. Instead, their work reaches across 50 centuries, not through fame, not through conquest, simply through preservation. The road also reshapes the modern understanding of prehistoric humanity. For much of recent history, people tended to divide the past into comforting categories. Written civilizations appeared advanced. Earlier societies appeared simple. The deeper one travelled into prehistory, the more primitive human life supposedly became. The archaeological evidence no longer supports such assumptions. Again and again, discoveries reveal planning, environmental knowledge, craftsmanship, cooperation, and long-distance exchange, flourishing thousands of years before writing spread across much of Europe. The impossible road stands among the clearest examples. Its builders leave no kings' names, no royal dynasties, no political histories. Yet they organize labor on impressive scales. They understand timber properties with remarkable sophistication. They adapt engineering to changing wetlands. They maintain transportation networks linking entire communities. Complexity clearly existed long before written records chose to describe it. Perhaps the greatest lesson concerns memory itself. Human memory is astonishingly short compared with geological time. 3 generations can preserve family stories. 10 generations may retain fragments of legend. 100 generations usually leave almost nothing recognizable. The impossible road belongs to people separated from the present by roughly 200 human generations. Every spoken word they uttered has vanished. Every song has disappeared. Every personal name has been forgotten. Every argument, celebration, friendship, and farewell dissolved long before the first historian began writing chronicles elsewhere. And yet, their footsteps still exist, not literally preserved upon every plank, but encoded within the structure itself. The worn surfaces reveal repeated travel. The repairs reveal determination. The carefully selected timber reveals planning. The engineering reveals confidence in the future. Without intending to, these anonymous builders left one of the most intimate autobiographies in all of archaeology, not written in language, written in action. Modern landscapes often encourage the illusion that they have always appeared as they do now. A coastline seems permanent. A marsh appears ancient beyond imagination. A quiet field feels timeless. The impossible road gently dismantles that illusion. Every landscape carries earlier versions of itself hidden beneath the present one. Forests become farmland. Rivers abandon old channels. Lakes fill with sediment. Grasslands become woodland. Coastlines migrate. Entire plains disappear beneath the sea. What appears permanent is often only the latest chapter in a much longer story. This understanding changes how archaeologists approach the world. Instead of asking only what once stood upon the land, they increasingly ask what kinds of land have vanished altogether. How many settlements now rest beneath coastal waters? How many forests sleep beneath peat bogs? How many roads disappeared completely because environmental conditions failed to preserve them? The impossible road is unlikely to be unique. It is simply one of the fortunate survivors. One lesser-known reality illustrates this perfectly. Across the North Sea, fishing boats continue bringing unexpected pieces of prehistory to the surface. Ancient bones, worked flint tools, fragments of antler, and traces of long-lost ecosystems emerge from the seabed during ordinary commercial activity. Each accidental discovery hints at landscapes still hidden beneath modern waters. Most have never been systematically explored. Technology is improving rapidly. Underwater mapping grows increasingly sophisticated. Environmental DNA, high-resolution sonar, remotely operated vehicles, and advanced sediment analysis promise future discoveries unimaginable only a generation ago. The vanished world crossed by the impossible road may eventually become far less mysterious. Or perhaps each answer will uncover even deeper questions. Archaeology has a habit of working that way. Every discovery broadens curiosity rather than ending it. The road, therefore, occupies an unusual position within history. It is both complete and incomplete. Enough survives to transform understanding. Enough remains missing to inspire decades of continued research. Few archaeological discoveries balance certainty and mystery so elegantly. There is comfort in that balance. The past should never become completely predictable. If every question already possessed a final answer, exploration would lose much of its meaning. Instead, each preserved timber invites another generation to look more carefully beneath familiar landscapes, to imagine forests where there are now seas, villages where there are now marshes, families where there is now silence. The impossible road ultimately reminds us that civilizations are not defined solely by what they build, but by the relationships those structures make possible. A road matters because people walk it together. Communities flourish because connection overcomes distance. Knowledge survives because one generation teaches another. Even after the settlements disappear, that deeper pattern continues. Modern researchers cooperate across disciplines, just as ancient builders once cooperated across wetlands, each contributing small pieces to a much larger journey of understanding. The road's final destination is therefore not the vanished village at its distant end. Its final destination is the present. Every preserved plank has completed a journey its builders could never have imagined, carrying their forgotten world safely across 5,000 years, until it reaches hands willing to listen once more to the quiet story hidden beneath the earth. The world that surrounded the impossible road disappears so gradually that no one living within it can ever identify the exact moment when it becomes the past. One generation notices wetter ground. Another builds a new crossing. A third settles slightly farther inland. The changes are small enough to accept, ordinary enough to explain away, and slow enough that daily life continues almost without interruption. Then, after enough centuries have passed, an entire landscape has slipped beyond memory. That quiet disappearance may be the most remarkable part of the story. The road survives because water hides it instead of destroying it. Peat, often seen as little more than dark earth beneath our feet, becomes an unlikely guardian. The same wetlands that eventually make the crossing unnecessary also seal it away from air, preserving the work of anonymous builders whose names have long since vanished. Without intending to, nature creates a vault more effective than stone. Standing beside one of these reconstructed trackways today, it is difficult not to imagine the countless ordinary journeys that once unfolded there. Farmers balancing heavy baskets after harvest, children carefully matching the footsteps of older relatives across damp planks, craftspeople carrying newly shaped tools toward neighbouring settlements, hunters returning at dusk while birds settled over the reeds. None of them believed they were participating in history. They were simply living another ordinary day. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson carried by the impossible road. History is not made only by rulers, monuments, or famous battles. It is also built from repeated acts of cooperation so familiar that they rarely seem worthy of remembrance. A bridge repaired before winter, timber cut for a neighbour, a safe path maintained because someone else will need it tomorrow. Those small decisions repeated over generations shape civilizations just as surely as the grand achievements recorded in chronicles. The landscape itself continues changing even now. Rivers still shift, coastlines still move, wetlands continue growing, forests expand in one place while disappearing in another. The earth beneath modern feet is no more permanent than the ground crossed by those ancient travellers. Given enough time, today's familiar maps will also become historical curiosities, replaced by landscapes future generations may struggle to imagine. Yet there is reassurance in that thought as well. Although worlds disappear, they rarely vanish completely. Fragments remain waiting beneath fields, beneath marshes, beneath quiet lakes, and beneath the sea. A preserved plank, a pollen grain, a footprint pressed into ancient mud, a forgotten forest sleeping below meters of peat. Each discovery reminds us that the past is never entirely gone. It simply becomes quieter, waiting patiently for someone willing to look beneath the surface. As evening settles across the vanished wetlands once more, the ancient road seems almost to emerge again in the imagination, stretching through mist toward villages that no longer stand. The voices have faded, the fires have gone out, and the travellers have long since completed their final journey. Yet the path they built still carries something forward. Not people this time, but memory itself, crossing the immense distance between their forgotten world and our own, with the same quiet purpose it held thousands of years ago.